Chapter 441. Crimson Dancer. 4. After Alisara's dance, which frankly felt more like a high-level psychological attack than a performance, we were served dinner. 5 courses, each meticulously crafted and presented with the kind of precision that made you wonder whether the chefs used nanobots or just very small knives. The food resembled Japanese cuisine from my old world. Delicate, balanced, beautiful in the way that only things which took 4 hours to prepare and 4 seconds to eat could be. It was delicious, no doubt about it. The kind of delicious that made your tongue briefly consider applying for citizenship. But I wasn't exactly in the mood to appreciate it. I was thinking, dangerous, I know. The vampires needed to be exposed. Not the cults, not the creepy robe-wearing doomsayers, no, the vampires. The Red Chalice cult was already known to the public, which was a deviation from the novel I'd read in my old life. But the real threat, the one slithering just out of sight, was still underground. Literally and metaphorically. The vampire monarch was supposed to recover slowly, gradually, give the heroes time to level up, unlock legendary weapons, sort out their feelings, and maybe open a bakery if they felt like it. But that timeline wasn't reliable anymore. Too many changes. Too many variables. If the monarch woke up early, we'd be neck-deep in fangs and blood faster than anyone could say, classified threat level. So maybe now was the right time. I had the martial king on my side, after all. That had to count for something. I couldn't afford to wait until I was stronger. That was the kind of logic that got protagonists killed just before the final boss fight. And then, in the middle of my internal world-ending monologue, "Open your mouth," came a voice so sweet and gentle it could have put sugar out of business. I obeyed without thinking, too deep in vampire planning mode to process anything. Something warm and savory landed on my tongue. See lotus dumpling. It practically dissolved, releasing a flavor that could win peace treaties. My taste buds gave it a standing ovation. I blinked. Rachel smiled beside me. "Don't think so much," she said. "You should enjoy yourself. The food here's actually pretty good, you know?" "Sorry," I muttered, "the way you do when you've just realized someone had to manually remind you to eat like a functioning organism. You're sitting awfully close, aren't you?" Cecilia's voice cut through the air like a well-aimed dagger wrapped in velvet. Her crimson eyes narrowed into that look she got when she was just about to deploy sarcasm as a lethal weapon. Only then did I realize where my left arm was. More specifically, what it was currently buried in. Rachel. Or to be precise, Rachel's side, which was pressing in just the right way to make my neurons short-circuit. "I was feeding him," Rachel clarified, tone sweet with the kind of innocence that wasn't fooling anyone, "since he clearly can't do it himself. Unlike a certain someone, I actually take care of him." That did it. Cecilia's brows dropped a few millimeters, which in her case was roughly the emotional equivalent of launching a warship. Across the table, I saw Rose's eyes narrow and Seraphina's fingers twitch, the kind of twitch that meant someone was about to pretend everything was fine while silently declaring social war. And then, "Nothing like a good old catfight to snap you out of your brooding," said Luna inside my head, unhelpful as always. I chose wisely to ignore her. "Arthur," came Lucifer's voice, smooth and calm like a still lake under starlight. He stood beside me, tall and perfectly composed, his uniform sharp, posture regal, the very image of a noble prince trained since birth to look like hope incarnate. The kind of man who stepped into a room and made people stand a little straighter without knowing why. "There's been a lot between us left unsaid," he said, a soft smile playing on his lips. "You've been gone a long time. Let's eat together, like old times." There was no edge in his voice, no smugness, no performance. Just sincerity wrapped in that ever-gentle tone of his, the kind that made people believe everything would be okay. Honestly, it was hard not to like Lucifer. He had that quiet hero quality, always polished, always humble, always somehow right. He was also, regrettably, my only male friend in this entire nightmare of a social ecosystem. I hadn't spent much time with him after returning from the well of miasma. Not by choice, just circumstance. My schedule had been hijacked by 4 very determined girls, each of whom had the patience of a missile. But now felt like a good time to change that. I'll catch up with you four later, I told the girls as I stood. They blinked at me as if I just suggested removing oxygen from the room. But I didn't waver. It wasn't like I hadn't already spent hours with them, and I was going to dance with each of them during the banquet. One meal wouldn't tip the balance of affection. To think Lucifer would. Cecilia began, then stopped herself. How can he even? I activated full mental noise suppression. There were just some things you didn't need to hear if you wanted to keep your sanity intact. Lucifer and I walked to the nearby table where Ren gave me a nod. The kind that meant glad you're here, don't expect a hug. Ian, true to form, looked like he'd just seen dessert arrive early and waved me over with bright enthusiasm. Ciola and Ava were already seated, looking appropriately aloof, like queens of parallel dimensions. These two don't mingle much, Ren commented as I sat. Not outcasts, Ava corrected sharply. We're just not keen on forced pleasantries. I understood. Students from the Eastern continent had to deal with hierarchy on hard mode. Sitting next to the daughters of the 5 great families probably felt like eating dinner in a diplomatic minefield. Blink wrong and someone would misinterpret it as an insult to their grandmother. And Gu? Ren asked, poking at the boundaries of Ava's patience. She's a different case, Ava replied, waving it off. Then her gaze sharpened like a blade. Anyway, Ren, tell me something. You seem to avoid girls like they've got a virus. Why's that? Ren narrowed his eyes. What are you implying? Ava looked at Ciola, who gave the world's smallest shrug, then plowed forward. Just that there's a rumor spreading. Apparently, the great Kagu heir prefers a different type of partner. Ian's soda shot out of his nose. Not mouth, nose. He doubled over coughing, and I was too busy holding in my own laughter to be much help. I managed a weak pat on his back. Lucifer, the model of composure moments ago, hunched forward, hand over his mouth as his shoulders trembled with silent laughter. Even the hero prince wasn't immune to this level of chaos. Ren? He stared, frozen, eyes wide, jaw slack, blinking rapidly like his internal systems had just blue-screened. It's because Prince Run refused to dance at every birthday banquet since turning 16, Ciola said, calm as ice. And that's a tradition, a very public one. Which means, Ava concluded, people notice. Ren opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. I don't like dancing, he said, finally, with the raw desperation of someone trying to shout over a hurricane. Sure, Ava said sweetly. That's exactly what I'd say too. And just like that, our table was ground zero for one of the Academy's most explosive rumors yet. But at least I was finally having dinner with a friend. A heroic one, who was also now laughing so hard he nearly dropped his water glass. Chapter 442. Crimson Dancer, 5. After the whole situation, which ended with Ren practically swearing a blood oath that he was, in fact, still interested in women, thank you very much. We finally reached the 5th course of dinner. I say we, but really I barely touched courses 2 through 4. A tactical blunder, really. The others were still talking. Or, in Ava's case, stirring the conversation like a pot she had no intention of eating from. Personally, Ava said as she sliced through a piece of synth scallop, I think the real scandal is that Ciola didn't reject a single dance invitation last year. Ola, composed as ever, paused only long enough to say, I accept invitations. I don't promise enjoyment. Ian choked on laughter. Ren muttered something about manners. Lucifer just smiled. And I was thinking, because Alisara's dance hadn't left me. Not really. It lingered like a half-formed headache just behind the eyes. That sort of performance didn't happen by accident. And it didn't happen without a cost. Then, ping, a familiar mana thread tapped my consciousness. Arthur, Lucifer's voice said in my mind. We both had fine mana control, enough for mental speech that didn't leak out into magical feedback or nosebleeds. Useful for quiet diplomacy, or awkward questions. What is it? I replied, taking a bite of my fish and pretending nothing was happening. Alisara, he said. She's the advisor of the Southern Sea Sun Palace. And she danced for us. What is going on between you and her? Of course he noticed. Lucifer noticed everything. I'd let my mask slip for just a second, and he'd caught it. She reminded me of someone, I admitted. A dangerous someone? He asked. Someone was once important to me, I said. Once. Then be careful, he replied. Because that dance had effects, even without mana. I saw half a dozen students with flushed faces, some barely breathing. That was one performance. Imagine what she could do with intent. I know, I said. We'll keep an eye on her. And then the music began. The subtle shift of atmosphere hit immediately. Soft violins backed by a hum of mana-infused resonance. The kind of music that meant one thing. The first dance of the welcome banquet was about to begin. And now came the part I'd expected. The game. Every banquet, the four girls, Cecilia, Rachel, Serafina, and Rose, played their little game of silent warfare. A strategic clash fought with glances, foot taps, and seating positions. The prize? The first dance with me. It wasn't officially declared, of course. That would be undignified. But I'd been around them long enough to recognize the signs. And I was just turning my head, curious who'd claimed the win this time. Arthur Nightingale. Came a calm, lilting voice. Alisara Velcroix stood before our table, poised with diplomatic grace. She was smiling, not broadly but precisely, like every angle of her face had been calculated for effect. Across the table, Ren froze mid-drink. Ian looked like he was about to start choking again. Ava's eyebrows rose with interest. Even Ciola tilted her head ever so slightly. Lucifer, for his part, wore the same thoughtful expression he used when a duel was brewing and he was pretending not to notice. "Would you grant me the first dance?" Alisara asked, her voice smooth as managlass. "As advisor of the Southern Sea Sun Palace, I believe it would serve as a gesture of unity between us and the outside world." It was clean, politely worded, unassailable, and it was a trap. The kind you could only spring at a public event with half the diplomatic channels in the world watching. Say no, and I'd insult the Southern Sea delegation. Say yes, and I'd ruin the little balance the four girls maintained, an opening move in a very different kind of war. I didn't even need to look back. I could feel the temperature change behind me. For sets of eyes, each uniquely trained to kill in a different way, now zeroed in on the back of my skull. I stood up. "Of course," I said, because that was what I had to say. Alisara offered her hand, and I took it. The silence was heavy, ceremonial. The crowd watched us move to the dance floor like it was a prelude to something important. And I knew one thing. As her fingers curled lightly into mine and the violins began to rise, this was going to cost me, and I had no idea how much. The dance floor cleared for us, other potential dancers retreating to the perimeter with practiced deference. This was more than a dance, it was a statement, a ceremonial opening that would be analyzed, discussed, and likely recorded in diplomatic archives. Alisara's hand rested in mine with deliberate lightness, neither yielding nor imposing. Up close, her fragrance was subtle but distinctive, something like midnight flowers and ozone, the scent of a storm about to break. "You dance, I assume?" she asked as we took position. Not a genuine question, a formality. "Adequately," I replied, matching her polite neutrality. The chamber orchestra shifted into the opening measures of a traditional Eastern waltz, modified for modern sensibilities. 3 beats, a pattern as ancient as formal diplomacy itself. We began to move. Alisara was, predictably, flawless. Her steps precise, her turns executed with liquid grace. This was different from her performance earlier, restrained, formal, appropriate for a diplomatic first dance. "You carry tension in your shoulders, Arthur Nightingale," she observed softly, her cyan green eyes studying me with clinical interest. "One might think you're uncomfortable. One might think many things," I countered, keeping my expression pleasant. "Indeed." A smile touched her lips, not reaching her eyes. "Perceptions are fascinating, aren't they? So easily managed, so rarely accurate." We turned, and I caught a glimpse of our audience. The 4 girls were watching with expressions ranging from diplomatic frost, Serpahina, to barely concealed murderous intent. Rachel. Lucifer's gaze followed us thoughtfully, while Lord Daedric observed from the high table with unreadable interest. Your companions seem displeased, Alisara noted, following my gaze. They'll survive. The question is, will you? Her tone remained light, conversational, but something in it sharpened. For remarkable young women, each laying claim. That must be complicated. Life often is, I replied evenly, guiding her through a turn. Diplomacy in answer, she acknowledged. You've been well trained. The music shifted subtly. Still a waltz, but the melody changed, morphing into something both unfamiliar and hauntingly recognizable. The tempo adjusted, slowing ever so slightly, and then Alisara changed. It was so subtle that no observer would notice. But beneath my hand, her posture shifted. The formal distance between us closed by millimeters. Her steps altered, still a waltz, but with a different emphasis, a unique pattern of weight shifts and pauses. Ice slipped down my spine as recognition dawned. This wasn't just any variation. This was Emma's dance. The private pattern we'd created together, a personal language of movement that had been ours alone. Every small peculiarity, the slight extension at the end of the third beat, the way she would momentarily yield before a turn, the characteristic tilt of her head during the suspension. It was all there, executed with impossible precision. My step faltered, nearly imperceptible, but she caught it. Her eyes met mine, and I saw it, knowledge, certainty, and something like triumph. Problem? She asked, voice honey-smooth. My mind raced. This couldn't be coincidence. Even perfect observation couldn't capture this level of detail. These weren't just dance steps but personal idiosyncrasies, private moments no one else had ever seen. Yet here they were, replicated perfectly by someone who couldn't possibly know them. I forced myself back into the rhythm, matching her movements with mechanical precision while my thoughts spun in freefall. You're full of surprises. Everyone has their talents, she replied, her fingers adjusting against mine in another gesture so familiar it burned. Mine just happened to be particularly versatile. The music continued its treacherous path, leading us through a ghost dance, Emma's dance, as other couples joined the floor around us. To them, we were simply executing an elegant waltz. Only I could see the phantom superimposed over reality, the past bleeding into the present with surgical precision. How? The question escaped before I could contain it, quiet enough that only she could hear. Alisara's smile deepened, satisfaction glimmering in her eyes. Perhaps we've met before in another context. Or perhaps some things transcend the boundaries we assume are fixed. The final measures approached. Her hand tightened fractionally on mine. Another gesture from the past. Another knife to the memory. The music ended. We paused in the formal closing position, her eyes holding mine for one beat longer than protocol required. Then she stepped back, offering the customary closing curtsy. I bowed in response, the movement automatic while my mind raced through implications, possibilities, dangers. Without another word, she turned and glided away, pink hair shimmering under the chandeliers as she returned to her place beside Lord Daedric. Not a single glance back, no acknowledgement of what had just transpired, the perfect diplomatic exit. I stood frozen for a heartbeat too long before turning back toward my table. The four girls were already moving in my direction, their expressions promising conversations ranging from interrogation to inquisition. But all I could hear was the thundering of my own heartbeat, pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Chapter 443. Investigation 1. The morning after the banquet, the air felt different, heavier somehow, like the weight of what we'd seen and what we suspected had crystallized overnight. I rubbed my temples, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my thoughts since last night. Something about Alisara's dance kept nagging at me, a phantom sense of familiarity I couldn't quite place. We gathered in the palace's grand assembly hall, where 200 students from Starcrest and Mythos academies filled the tiered seats. The scale of our investigation force was impressive. A small army of talented young mages and warriors, backed by some of the most powerful figures in the world. Lee Zenith stood at the center of the room, his silver-threaded robes catching the early light that streamed through the high windows. Beside him, Professor Nero's darker silhouette created a striking contrast, light and shadow, both equally formidable in their own way. "We face a considerable task," Lee announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the hall. "Therefore, we will divide into 20 teams of approximately 10 students each, with supervising professors assigned accordingly." A holographic map of the palace and its grounds materialized in the air above him, sections lighting up in different colors as he spoke. "Each team will focus on specific areas. Teams 1 through 5 will investigate the eastern sections," Lee continued, gesturing to the glowing red portions of the map. "Teams 6 through 10 will cover the western wing and underground levels. Teams 11 through 15 will focus on the central palace, administrative buildings, and courtyards. The remaining teams will investigate the outer grounds, servant quarters, and peripheral structures." I caught Jin's eye across the hall. His face remained impassive, but I could read the calculation in his gaze. We both knew what was at stake here. This wasn't just an academic exercise or diplomatic formality. Something was wrong within these gilded walls, and we needed to find it before it found us. Team 3 will include Arthur Nightingale, Jean Ashbluff, Ava Pang, Hiro Yamada, and Lyra Chen. Lee's voice pulled me back from my thoughts. I nodded, though my mind briefly drifted to last night's banquet. Alisara's cyan green eyes as they had locked with mine during her performance. A gesture that had sent an inexplicable chill through me. The way her pink hair had cascaded as she moved, something about it tugged at memories I didn't know I had. "Arthur." Jin's voice pulled me back to the present. He had made his way over and stood beside me, eyebrow raised in question. "Sorry," I muttered, forcing my focus back to the meeting. Jin's presence was a reminder of the mana oath that bound us. Not that he needed the reminder. Jean was sharp enough to recognize the importance of this investigation without magical compulsion. The assignments continued, with the 3 princesses placed in separate teams to maximize their influence. Rachel would join Team 11 in the Central Palace. Cecilia was assigned to Team 7 in the Western Wing, while Serafina would work with Team 16 on the outer grounds. Lucifer, Ran, and Ciola were scattered similarly, ensuring our strongest students covered key locations. All around us, students were organizing into their assigned groups, their expressions ranging from excitement to nervous determination. For many, this was their first real mission, a chance to prove themselves on a stage that mattered. As the assignments concluded, a contingent of palace officials entered the hall. Tall, stern-faced men and women in crimson robes, each bearing the red sun emblem. Their expressions ranged from barely concealed hostility to diplomatic blankness. "Each investigation team will be assigned a palace representative," announced one of them, a woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun. "They will guide you through your assigned areas and answer appropriate questions." The palace representatives moved through the crowd, finding their designated teams. Our guide was Advisor Corin, a man whose face seemed permanently set in lines of disapproval. His eyes, dark and watchful, swept over us with thinly veiled suspicion. "I will show you the northeastern section of the East Wing," he said, his voice as dry as old parchment. "There are, of course, certain restricted areas that remain off-limits even to investigators." The pause before the last word made his feelings about our presence perfectly clear. Jean and I exchanged glances. This would complicate things. "We understand the need for discretion," I replied, keeping my tone respectfully neutral. "But our investigation must be thorough to be meaningful." Corin's lips thinned almost imperceptibly. "Of course. Follow me." The northeastern section of the Southern Sea Sun Palace was a study in contrasts. Grand halls opened into intimate courtyards. Opulent galleries gave way to austere meditation chambers. We documented everything meticulously: the flow of mana through ancient ward stones, the architectural peculiarities, the placement of guards and servants. While Ava engaged our guide with questions about the palace's defensive enchantments, Jean lingered near the ornately carved walls, his fingers tracing inscriptions that predated the palace's isolation. To anyone watching, he appeared to be studying historical markings. I knew better. Jean was extending his necromantic senses, feeling for the telltale signatures of death magic or unnatural preservation. Anything that might suggest vampire activity. His expression remained studiously neutral, but when our paths crossed near a massive tapestry depicting the palace's founding, he muttered under his breath, "Something's not right in the north corner." I followed his gaze to an unassuming door, sealed with both physical locks and magical wards. Unlike the other doors in the corridor, this one bore no markings or decorations. Its plainness made it stand out among the ornate surroundings. "Yes, master, I picked up something as well," Erebus commented in my mind. For a moment I froze. The door's simple design triggered another flash of memory, not from this world, but from somewhere else. A plain white door leading to a small apartment. A key in my hand. Someone waiting inside. "Arthur." Jin's voice cut through the fog. "Are you listening?" I blinked, the phantom memory fading. "Yes. The door. Let's check it out." "Advisor Corin," I called, approaching the door with measured steps. "What lies beyond this entrance?" Corin materialized at my side with surprising speed. "Old storage. Nothing of interest to investigators." "Then you wouldn't mind if we took a look?" I kept my tone light, curious rather than challenging. "I'm afraid that's not possible." His refusal was immediate, brooking no argument. "This area is restricted due to palace tradition. Some spaces are reserved for ceremonial purposes only." "What ceremonies?" Jean asked, his voice neutral but his eyes sharp. "Private matters," Corin replied stiffly. "Family traditions of the Solaran line." I studied the door again, noting the freshness of the ward sigils. Whatever lay beyond had been sealed recently, not by ancient tradition. I reached out, my fingertips hovering just above the ward. A faint resonance hummed through the air, blood magic. Not strong enough to be vampire magic, but adjacent to it. "I understand tradition," I said carefully, "but our investigation requires access to all areas of the palace. Exceptions create blind spots." "Nevertheless," Corin said, his tone hardening, "this area remains restricted." I exchanged a glance with Jean before making a decision. "I'll need to discuss this with Professor Lee." Corin's expression tightened, but he nodded curtly. "As you wish." While Jean went to fetch Lee, I remained by the door, studying its wards. The symbols seemed to blur before my eyes, rearranging themselves into a pattern that made my head throb. A sense of déjà vu washed over me, so powerful I had to steady myself against the wall. Why does this feel familiar? When Lee arrived, the ensuing discussion was a masterclass in diplomatic pressure. Lee never raised his voice, never made explicit threats, but the weight of his position and power hung in the air like an unsheathed blade. "The Eastern continent has extended every courtesy," Lee said, his calm voice underscored with steel. "We've respected the palace's sovereignty while conducting our investigation. But selective restrictions undermine the very purpose of our presence here." I tried to follow the negotiation, but my thoughts kept drifting to Alisara. Her movements during the dance, they hadn't just been elegant, they'd been familiar. The way she had turned her wrist, the tilt of her head, it was as if I'd seen them before, somewhere beyond this life. "Arthur," Lee's voice pulled me back. "Do you have something to add?" I struggled to reorient myself. "The wards are fresh," I managed. "Whatever they're protecting, it's not ancient tradition." Lee nodded, turning back to Corin. The palace advisor held firm for several minutes, citing tradition and protocol, but eventually conceded under the steady pressure of Lee's presence. "You may return tomorrow," he said finally, his voice strained, "with proper authorization from Lord Daedric himself. Until then, this area remains sealed." Lee inclined his head slightly. "Fair enough. We'll continue our investigation elsewhere for now." As Corin led us away, I couldn't help but wonder what lay behind that unassuming door that warranted such protection. Whatever it was, the palace was determined to keep it hidden, which only made me more determined to find it. At the end of the day, representatives from each of the 40 investigation teams gathered in one of the palace's larger meeting rooms. The air buzzed with suppressed excitement and frustration as team leaders shared their findings. The pattern was unmistakable. Each team had encountered similar resistance, with certain areas deemed off-limits despite the supposed openness of the investigation. Team 8 found a sealed chamber beneath the Western Observatory, reported a senior student from Starcrest. When we requested access, we were told it contained delicate astronomical equipment, too sensitive for visitors. Team 14 was denied access to the Central Archives, added another. Apparently, some records are too historically significant to be viewed by outsiders. They're hiding something, Lucifer said bluntly, voicing what we were all thinking. It's not just one area or one excuse. It's systematic. Magnus Dracar, who had spent the day in high-level discussions with palace officials, stood at the head of the table. Almost certainly, he agreed, but direct confrontation may not serve us best. For now, follow protocol. Document everything. The restrictions themselves tell us something valuable about what they might be hiding. Push boundaries where strategically appropriate, but don't antagonize unnecessarily. And if they continue to obstruct us? Ren asked, his usual calm tinged with frustration. Then we'll reconsider our approach, Magnus replied. His gaze swept across our faces, settling briefly on mine. Patience for now. We have 200 investigators covering every inch of this palace. Something will slip through their guard. I nodded, though my mind was already elsewhere. Through the meeting room's windows, I caught a glimpse of movement in the garden beyond. A flash of pink that drew my eye like a beacon. Alisara walked slowly along a stone path, pausing by a fountain to trail her fingers through the water. As the meeting dispersed, with team representatives heading back to brief their full groups, I felt a prickling sensation at the base of my neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the shadowed gallery that overlooked our meeting space. I needed to pull myself together. Too many lives depended on it. Chapter 444. Investigation 2. The authorization document felt heavy in my hands. The crimson wax seal bearing Daedric's emblem still warm to the touch. Getting it had taken Magnus' direct intervention and hours of diplomatic wrangling. Daedric's reluctance was evident in every carefully worded restriction on the document. We could enter the sealed room, but only for 2 hours with our original team composition and under the continued supervision of Advisor Corrin. Small victories, Jean murmured beside me as we approached the unassuming door that had blocked our progress yesterday. Advisor Corrin was already waiting, his posture rigid with displeasure. When he saw us, his lips thinned to nearly nothing. "You have your authorization, I see," he said, the words clipped and precise. I handed him the document, signed by Lord Daedric himself. Corrin examined it with meticulous care, perhaps hoping to find some flaw or loophole that would allow him to turn us away. Finding none, he produced an ornate key from within his robes, its handle shaped like the red sun symbol. 2 hours, he reminded us sharply. Not a minute more. The key turned in the lock with a heavy, metallic groan. Simultaneously, Corrin pressed his palm against the center of the door, whispering words in an archaic dialect that made the wards shimmer briefly before fading. As the door swung open, a rush of stale air greeted us, cold and dry, with the unmistakable scent of old paper and dust. The chamber beyond was larger than I'd expected, with high ceilings supported by slender columns. Shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of ancient tomes and yellowed scrolls. Tables cluttered with documents occupied the center space, while glass display cases contained what appeared to be historical artifacts. An archive? Ava asked, surprise evident in her voice. The Historical Records Repository, Corrin corrected stiffly. And I must insist you touch nothing without consulting me first. Some of these documents are irreplaceable. We spread out, each taking a different section. Hero and Lyra focused on the display cases, while Jean headed for a section of particularly old scrolls in the far corner. Ava began examining the room itself, her fingers occasionally tracing patterns in the air as she sensed the magical currents within the space. I approached the central tables, where large sheets of architectural plans lay partially unrolled. The papers were yellowed with age, their edges crumbling, but the designs themselves were surprisingly precise, detailed blueprints of the Southern Sea Sun Palace in various stages of development. The oldest plans showed a much smaller structure, little more than a fortress built around what appeared to be a natural cavern. Successive layers documented the palace's growth over centuries, each expansion more elaborate than the last. What caught my attention, however, were the most recent additions. Crisp white paper overlaid on the ancient blueprints, showing modifications to the palace foundations, particularly beneath the central courtyard. "These are recent," I murmured, examining the dates. "Within the last 5 years." My focus wavered momentarily as a flash of pink caught my peripheral vision. I turned sharply, half expecting to see Alisara, but there was nothing, just the momentary play of light through a stained glass window high above. These strange distractions were becoming more frequent, threatening to derail my concentration at critical moments. Jean appeared at my shoulder, a dusty scroll cradled carefully in his hands. "Arthur, you need to see this." The scroll he held was written in an archaic script, faded but still legible. As I read, certain phrases jumped out: covenant of protection, shelter from persecution, alliance against common enemies. "What is this?" I asked, my voice low to avoid Corin's attention. "Some kind of historical alliance record," Jean replied, equally quiet, "dating back to the founding of the palace. It references an agreement between the First Lord Solarin and an unnamed group seeking refuge from those who would destroy them for their practices." "Any indication who these refugees were?" I asked, scanning the document. Jean shook his head. "The language is deliberately vague. Could be a persecuted magical sect, political exiles. The text only mentions they practiced arts deemed forbidden by the orthodoxy of the age." I studied the document further, trying to concentrate despite the persistent fog in my mind. There was something here, a connection I wasn't seeing clearly. "The timing," I said slowly. "When was this document written?" Jean checked the date markings. "Approximately 800 years ago, during the Age of Purification." The Age of Purification, a dark period when the dominant magical institutions had violently suppressed practices they deemed impure. Many magical traditions had been driven underground or eradicated entirely. Blood magic had been among those persecuted, though it wasn't inherently dark. Even necromancy, Jin's specialty, had nearly been wiped out. Before I could pursue this line of thought, Ava called for our attention. She stood in the center of the room, her foot tapping lightly against the floor. "There's something beneath us," she said, her voice hushed but excited. "A magical construct of some kind, heavily warded." She knelt down, brushing aside dust to reveal an intricately patterned rug. With careful movements, she rolled it back, exposing smooth stone tiles, and at their center a trapdoor, its edges nearly invisible against the surrounding floor. "This is sophisticated work," Ava murmured, her fingers hovering just above the surface. Golden light emanated from her fingertips as she traced the outline of the wards. "Multiple layers of protection. The outermost is detection. It signals whenever someone approaches. Then concealment, diversion, and at the core—" "That's interesting. What is it?" I asked, kneeling beside her. "It's a resonance lock," she said, "keyed to a specific magical signature, likely the Solarin bloodline. It's an uncommon technique, typically used for securing family vaults or heritage sites." Throughout this exchange, I'd been aware of Advisor Corin watching us with increasing agitation. Now he strode forward, placing himself between us and the trapdoor. "You've exceeded your authorization," he said flatly. "Lord Daedric permitted you to examine the archive, not to break into sealed chambers beneath it." "We're not breaking anything," I replied evenly. "We're investigating as we're mandated to do." "The area below this chamber is not part of your mandate," Corin insisted, his voice rising slightly. "It contains private family relics of no relevance to your investigation." Jean stepped forward, the ancient scroll still in his hands. If there's no relevance, why hide it behind such complex wards? Ordinary family relics wouldn't warrant this level of protection. Corrin's face tightened with anger. He reached into his robe and withdrew a small, crystalline object that pulsed with crimson light. "Guard summons," Ava whispered, recognizing the device. Before Corrin could activate it, I caught his wrist. "Think carefully, advisor. Summoning guards transforms this into a diplomatic incident. Is that what you want?" For a moment, tension crackled between us. Then, the door swung open as Professor Lee Zenith strode in, his silver-threaded robes billowing behind him. His timing was too perfect to be coincidental. He'd been monitoring our progress, anticipating trouble. "Is there a problem?" Lee asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable undertone of authority. Corrin pulled his wrist from my grip, straightening his robes with exaggerated dignity. "Professor Lee, your students are attempting to access restricted areas beyond their authorization." Lee glanced at the exposed trapdoor, then at the documents spread across the table. His eyes lingered on the architectural plans and the ancient scroll before returning to Corrin. "It seems to me," Lee said carefully, "that they've made significant discoveries that warrant further investigation. The trapdoor appears to lead somewhere of interest." "It leads to a private family vault," Corrin insisted. "Lord Daedric would never permit outsiders to enter." Lee considered this for a moment. "Then let us ask him directly. I propose a compromise. We seal this room exactly as it is now with our findings intact. Tomorrow, we'll return with Lord Daedric's explicit permission regarding the trapdoor specifically." The suggestion was reasonable, designed to give Corrin no grounds for refusal without appearing openly obstructive. Still, the advisor hesitated, clearly weighing his options. "I will need to discuss this with Lord Daedric," he said finally. "Of course," Lee agreed. "In the meantime, we'll document what we've found here. The architectural plans, in particular, show some fascinating recent modifications." Corrin's eyes narrowed at the implicit threat. "Refuse our reasonable request, and we'll focus our attention on other suspicious elements we've already discovered." "Very well," he said stiffly. "You may return tomorrow, provided Lord Daedric approves." As we left the archive, the door being sealed once more behind us, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and frustration. We'd found something, historical records suggesting the palace had sheltered some persecuted group centuries ago, and evidence of recent structural changes. But the most significant discovery, whatever lay beneath that trapdoor, remained just out of reach. Later, I reported our findings to Magnus in his temporary quarters. His expression remained neutral as I described the document and the recent architectural modifications, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. "A resonance lock," he mused when I finished. "Interesting choice for family relics. Jean thinks the archive confirms the palace once sheltered a persecuted magical sect," I said. "Given their isolation and secrecy, it fits with their historical pattern. But the question remains, why the recent modifications? Why the heightened security?" Magnus leaned back, fingers steepled together. "I'll speak with Daedric directly about the trapdoor. His reaction might tell us something useful." Chapter 445. Investigation 3. The following morning brought disappointing but unsurprising news. Daedric had denied our request to investigate beneath the trapdoor. "Family secrets and ancient traditions," Magnus reported with a wry twist to his lips. "Apparently, the chamber contains sacred artifacts dating back to the palace's founding, too delicate and spiritually significant to be viewed by outsiders." "You don't believe him," I said. "It wasn't a question." "I believe he's hiding something," Magnus replied. "Whether it's what we suspect or something else entirely remains to be seen." Our team was reassigned to investigate the palace's eastern supply storage, a seemingly mundane task that left me bristling with frustration. If Daedric thought busy work would deter us, he'd seriously underestimated our determination. The storage facilities turned out to be vast, spreading beneath the eastern wing like a hidden city. Rows upon rows of shelving units held everything from basic provisions to rare alchemical ingredients, all meticulously catalogued and arranged. This place could sustain the palace for years, Ava observed as we made our way through the labyrinthine space. It's beyond ordinary preparation. I nodded, my thoughts momentarily distracted by another flash of memory. The scent of jasmine, a warm hand against my cheek. I shook my head sharply, trying to clear it. Arthur. Jin's voice pulled me back. Did you hear me? Sorry, I muttered. What did you say? Jean gave me an odd look but continued. I said these supply quantities don't match the palace's supposed population. There's enough here for thousands, but the palace only houses a few hundred residents, according to official records. I focused on the shelves, noting the quantities with newfound interest. Jean was right. The provisions were excessive, even accounting for emergencies or isolation. Maybe they're preparing for something, I suggested, or supporting more people than they acknowledge. We continued our survey, documenting discrepancies and unusual stockpiles. In one section, we found an entire row dedicated to medical supplies, blood transfusion equipment, specialized pharmaceuticals, and regenerative compounds. This is military-grade medical storage, Hiro noted, examining a container of advanced healing agents. You'd see this in a field hospital, not a traditional palace. The question is, who are they healing? I asked. Before anyone could respond, Advisor Corin appeared at the end of the aisle, flanked by 2 palace guards. His expression was as sour as ever, but there was a new tension in his posture. Your time in this section is concluded, he announced. You're needed elsewhere. We've barely started, Jean protested, gesturing to the vast rows still unexplored. Nevertheless, your presence is required in the Eastern Ceremonial Hall. Lord Daedric wishes to address all investigation teams regarding protocol adjustments. I exchanged glances with my teammates. This felt like a diversion, an attempt to pull us away from something we might discover. We'll be there shortly, I said, making a show of organizing our notes. Corin's eyes narrowed. Now, Mr. Nightingale, the Lord of the Palace does not appreciate delays. With no choice but to comply, we followed Corin out of the storage facility. As we walked, I hung back slightly, pretending to check my records while actually scanning our surroundings. At a junction of corridors, I noticed a heavily guarded door, unusual for a storage area. 6 guards stood at attention, their uniforms bearing additional insignias not seen elsewhere in the palace. I made a mental note of the location before hurrying to catch up with the others. Daedric's address turned out to be exactly what I'd suspected, a time-wasting exercise designed to interrupt our investigations. He droned on about cultural sensitivities and appropriate boundaries, essentially stating that more areas would be restricted going forward. The Southern Sea Sun Palace has graciously opened its doors, he intoned from a raised dais, his crimson eyes sweeping over the assembled investigators. But certain spaces remain sacred to our traditions and must be respected as such. I noticed Magnus and Lee exchange glances. This wasn't unexpected, but it confirmed Daedric's increasing attempts to obstruct our work. After the address, our team was reassigned yet again, this time to the Eastern Residential Quarters, where palace staff and lower-ranking officials lived. The message was clear. Daedric was steering us away from sensitive areas. This is getting ridiculous, Jean muttered as we walked. They're just moving us in circles. Which means we're getting close to something, I replied. Let's make the most of this assignment. Talk to the staff, see what they know. We split up to cover more ground, each taking a different section of the residential area. I focused on the servants' quarters, hoping they might be more forthcoming than the officials. The servants proved cautious but not entirely closed off. Most answered basic questions about their duties and routines, though they clammed up whenever the conversation steered toward restricted areas or unusual activities. One elderly man, who introduced himself as Terran, was more talkative than most. He'd spent his entire life in the palace, serving 3 generations of the Solaran family. Things changed about 5 years ago, he told me as he folded linens in a small laundry room. New rules, new restrictions. Areas that had been open for centuries suddenly became off-limits, even to servants who'd worked there for decades. What kind of areas? I asked casually. The deep cellars beneath the central courtyard, for one, he replied. Used to help store wine there myself. Now it's guarded day and night. He shook his head. And the Western Observatory, that was always my favorite place to watch the sunset. Sealed up tight now. Any idea why? Taryn glanced around nervously before leaning closer. Some say Lord Daedric made a deal with outsiders. Gave them sanctuary in exchange for something valuable. But it's just talk among the servants, he added hastily. No one knows for certain. These outsiders, I pressed. Has anyone seen them? Not exactly, no. But supplies go missing. Extra food disappears from the kitchens. Medical supplies get restocked more often than they should. He shrugged. And sometimes late at night you hear things. Movement in supposedly empty corridors. Voices where there shouldn't be any. I was about to ask more when a sharp pain lanced through my head. The laundry room blurred, replaced momentarily by another scene. A university library, sunlight streaming through tall windows, the same pink-haired woman sitting across from me. Textbooks spread between us. Her lips moved, saying something I couldn't quite hear. Sir? Are you all right? Taryn's concerned voice pulled me back to reality. I pressed a hand to my temple, willing the disorientation to pass. Yes, just a headache. Thank you for your time, Taryn. As I left the laundry room, I tried to make sense of these increasingly intrusive visions. They felt like memories, but from a life I'd never lived. And always featuring the same woman, a woman who looked disturbingly like Alisara. I met up with the others at our designated rendezvous point. Each had similar stories to share, hints and rumors, but nothing concrete. Staff had noticed changes in recent years, increased secrecy, areas becoming restricted, but no one could or would say exactly why. It's like trying to see through fog, Ava said in frustration. We're getting impressions, not information. Sometimes patterns tell us more than facts, Jean observed. The consistent timeline, 5 years ago, matches with the architectural modifications we found. Something changed then. Something that requires medical supplies, extra food, and increased security. I added, sharing what I'd learned from Taryn. We compiled our findings, slim though they were, and prepared to report back to Magnus. Chapter 446. Investigation 4. The third day of investigation brought new restrictions and more blatant obstruction. Entire wings of the palace were suddenly closed for ceremonial preparations. And our team assignments grew increasingly mundane. We were relegated to examining the Eastern Gardens, beautiful but strategically irrelevant. They're stonewalling us, Ava said as we walked among meticulously sculpted hedges. Every time we find something promising, we're reassigned. I nodded, my frustration mounting. The investigation was stalling, and worse, my concentration continued to splinter. The visions, memories, were growing more frequent, more vivid. They came without warning, triggered by seemingly random things. A particular shade of pink, the scent of jasmine, certain angles of sunlight. We need to change our approach, I said, pulling myself back to the present. Instead of following their assignments, let's focus on what they're trying to hide. The central courtyard, Jean suggested immediately. Multiple sources have mentioned changes there. And the Western Observatory, I added, recalling Taryn's information. How do we get access when they're actively preventing it? Hero asked. I considered our options. Direct confrontation would only result in more diplomatic maneuvering. We needed a subtler approach. The evening reception, I said slowly. Tonight's cultural exchange event. Most of the palace officials will be occupied, including our shadows. Jean caught on immediately. A perfect opportunity for a small, unofficial excursion. Precisely, I agreed. Ava, Jean, and I will slip away during the reception. The rest of you maintain our presence there. Make sure we're not missed. The plan set, we continued our perfunctory examination of the gardens. As we worked, I found my gaze drawn to a palace balcony where Alisara stood watching us, her pink hair catching the sunlight. Unlike the furtive glimpses I'd had before, She made no attempt to hide her observation. When our eyes met, she smiled, a gesture that sent another spike of disorientation through me. "She's been watching you specifically," Ava noted quietly. "Not just today, throughout the investigation." "I've noticed," I replied, trying to sound unconcerned despite the turmoil in my mind. "Any idea why?" Jean asked. I shook my head, unwilling to share the strange visions and the unsettling similarities between Alisara and the woman in them. "Maybe she's just curious about the outsiders." Jean didn't look convinced, but he dropped the subject as we continued our assigned task. Later, as the palace prepared for the evening reception, we finalized our plans. The cultural exchange event would bring together representatives from both the Southern Sea Sun Palace and the Eastern Continent in a display of diplomatic goodwill, despite the tensions of the investigation. "We'll slip away 30 minutes after the formal speeches," I said as we met briefly in my quarters. "The Western Observatory first, then the central courtyard if time permits." "What are we looking for exactly?" Ava asked. "Anything that explains the recent changes," I replied. "Evidence of these outsiders Terran mentioned, or whatever they're using the Red Sun's energy for." The reception transformed the central hall of the palace into a showcase of cultural exchange. Representatives from both sides performed traditional arts, shared culinary delicacies, and engaged in carefully diplomatic conversations. Beneath the veneer of cooperation, however, I could sense the undercurrent of tension. Palace officials watching the investigators closely, and vice versa. Daedric presided over the event from a raised dais, his crimson eyes constantly scanning the crowds. Beside him sat Alisara, resplendent in robes that seemed to shift from deep red to vibrant pink as she moved. Even from a distance, I could feel her gaze following me, and it took considerable effort to avoid looking in her direction. After the formal speeches and initial performances, I gave the signal to Jean and Ava. With practiced casualness, we drifted to different parts of the hall, then slipped out through separate exits when attention was focused on a particularly spectacular display of Eastern fire magic. We regrouped in a small antechamber as planned, quickly checking that we hadn't been followed. "We have perhaps an hour before our absence might be noticed," Ava whispered. "Where do we start?" "The Western Observatory," I replied. "It's further from the reception, so there should be fewer people around." Moving through the palace unsupervised was risky, but the reception had pulled most of the guards and officials away from their normal posts. We encountered only a few servants, who paid us little attention as we walked purposefully, as if on official business. The western wing of the palace had a different character from the eastern sections we'd been investigating, older, more austere, with fewer of the recent renovations evident elsewhere. The observatory itself was housed in a tower that rose above the surrounding structures, accessible through a spiraling staircase. As we approached, however, it became clear that the observatory wasn't as unguarded as we'd hoped. 2 palace guards stood at the base of the stairs, their posture alert despite the lateness of the hour. "Now what?" Jean murmured as we ducked back around a corner. I considered our options, none of them ideal. We couldn't force our way past the guards without creating an incident, and we didn't have time for an elaborate distraction. "There must be another way up," I said, studying the layout of the surrounding corridors. "Service access, perhaps?" Ava pointed to a narrow door partially hidden behind a tapestry. "There. Maintenance passage, most likely." The door was locked, but Ava made quick work of the simple mechanism with a clever application of her ward-breaking techniques. The passage beyond was narrow and dusty, clearly unused for some time. It led to a cramped spiral staircase that wound upward alongside the main one. We ascended carefully, the worn steps creaking despite our caution. The passage eventually opened into a small anteroom adjacent to the observatory proper. Unlike the grand staircase, this entrance wasn't guarded, but it was sealed with multiple wards, far more complex than a mere maintenance door should require. "These are serious protections," Ava whispered, examining the magical barriers. "Detection wards, locking enchantments, even an alarm trigger. Whatever they're hiding, they really don't want anyone finding it." "Can you bypass them?" I asked. She studied the configurations for a moment, then nodded slowly. I think so, but it will take time and concentration. If anything goes wrong, it will trigger the alarms instantly. Do it, I said. Jean and I will keep watch. While Ava worked on the wards, Jean and I positioned ourselves to monitor both the maintenance passage and the main entrance to the observatory. Through a small window in the anteroom, I could see the guards still standing at attention at the base of the grand staircase. Ava's work was methodical and precise, her fingers tracing complex patterns in the air as she carefully neutralized each layer of protection. After nearly 15 minutes of intense concentration, she finally straightened with a relieved sigh. Done, she whispered. We have maybe 10 minutes before the temporary bypasses start to fail. The door opened silently, revealing the observatory beyond. The circular chamber was dominated by a massive telescope that pointed skyward through a retractable section of the dome ceiling. Unlike the dusty maintenance passage, the observatory was immaculately maintained, its instruments gleaming in the faint light. But it wasn't being used for astronomy. The telescope had been modified, its lens replaced with a complex array of crystals that seemed to capture and focus light. Cables and conduits led from the array to a central platform where a large, pulsing crystal the size of a small car sat mounted in an elaborate frame. It's a conductor, Ava breathed, moving closer to examine the setup. They're using the observatory to channel light from the red sun artifact directly into this crystal. Jean studied the equipment with a frown. But for what purpose? I approached the central platform, careful not to touch anything. The crystal pulsed with a rhythmic glow, each beat sending ripples of energy along the cables that led from it. The cables disappeared into the floor, suggesting they continued to some location beneath the observatory. They're redirecting the red sun's energy, I said, the pieces beginning to align in my mind. Channeling it somewhere else in the palace. The central courtyard, Jean suggested. That's where the recent structural modifications were focused. Before we could investigate further, a faint sound from the main staircase caught our attention, voices growing closer. The guards were changing rotation, and their replacements were coming up to the observatory. Time to go, I whispered urgently. We slipped back through the maintenance door just as the main entrance opened. Ava quickly reactivated the wards behind us, though in her haste, she couldn't restore them completely to their original state. Anyone examining them closely would know they'd been tampered with. We descended the cramped staircase as quickly as we dared, painfully aware of how vulnerable we'd be if discovered. Only when we reached the lower levels and emerged into an empty corridor did we pause to catch our breath. That was close, Jean muttered, glancing back toward the observatory tower. But worth it, Ava added. Now we know they're channeling the red sun's energy. The question is, to where and for what? The central courtyard seems our best bet, I said, checking the time. But we've been gone from the reception too long already. If we don't return soon, our absence will be noticed. Reluctantly, we agreed to postpone further exploration and return to the cultural event. The information we'd gathered was valuable but incomplete, a piece of the puzzle rather than the full picture. Chapter 447. Investigation 5. After the reception ended, our team gathered in Magnus' quarters to report our findings. The Marshal King listened without interruption as we described the modified observatory and its energy channeling function. Interesting, he said when we finished, his expression thoughtful. A sophisticated setup for redirecting the red sun's power. The question is, what are they using it for? Healing, perhaps? Jean suggested. Given the medical supplies we found earlier, and the rumors about outsiders needing sanctuary. Magnus nodded slowly. The red sun's rejuvenation capabilities are legendary. If they're channeling that power to heal someone, it would explain the secrecy and the resources being diverted. But who are they healing? Ava asked. And why all the elaborate measures to hide it? Someone they don't want the world to know about, I said, the implications hanging heavily in the air. None of us voiced the most obvious possibility, that the palace might be sheltering and healing vampires or cultists, those who would be hunted if discovered. In my mind, however, I was certain. The novel had been clear about the Southern Sea Sun Palace's fall to the vampires. It was the first domino to topple, the initial foothold for their return. And the vampire monarch, gravely wounded by Liam Kagu nearly 2 centuries ago, would need extraordinary healing to recover from wounds that should have been fatal. The Red Sun's rejuvenation capabilities would be perfect for such a task. But I kept these thoughts to myself. Without concrete evidence, such claims would sound delusional. Whatever the truth is, Magnus continued, we're running out of time to discover it. Tomorrow is our final full day of official investigation before the diplomatic deadline expires. Daedric has made it clear he wants us gone after that. We need access to what's beneath the central courtyard, I said firmly. Everything we've found points there, the channeled energy, the water systems, the supply routes. Magnus rubbed his chin thoughtfully. I'll make one more formal request, but expect another refusal. In the meantime, continue analyzing what we've gathered. Look for patterns we might have missed, connections between seemingly unrelated findings. As the meeting disbanded, Jean lingered behind, waiting until the others had left before speaking. You have theories you're not sharing, he said. It wasn't a question. I measured my response carefully. I have suspicions based on historical patterns. Nothing concrete enough to bring up formally. Jean studied me for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable. The Red Chalice cult was believed extinct after Liam Kagu's purge. Same with the vampires. But legends rarely die so easily. No, I agreed. They don't. If, hypothetically, the Southern Sea Sun Palace were sheltering survivors from that purge, Jean continued, his voice deliberately casual, it would explain their centuries of isolation, their determination to remain cut off from the world. I nodded, grateful for Jin's careful framing. And if those survivors included someone powerful enough to warrant all these resources, someone like the vampire monarch himself, Jean finished, barely above a whisper. Our eyes met in silent understanding. Jean hadn't read the novel, didn't know what I knew, but he'd pieced together the same conclusion from the evidence we'd gathered. It would be an extraordinary claim, I said. One we couldn't make without extraordinary proof. Which is exactly what lies beneath the central courtyard, Jean replied, and which Daedric is determined to keep us from discovering. We parted ways, the weight of our unspoken concerns hanging between us. If our suspicions were correct, the Southern Sea Sun Palace wasn't merely hiding historical relics or practicing forbidden magic. They were actively helping restore one of the greatest threats the world had ever faced. In my quarters, I systematically reviewed our findings, searching for any additional evidence that might strengthen our case. The pieces aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. The timeline of 5 years ago matching the first whispers of renewed cult activity, the specialized medical supplies, the blood transport system, the channeled healing energy of the Red Sun. It was the vampire monarch. It had to be. And the Red Chalice cult was helping to restore him to power, with the Southern Sea Sun Palace's willing cooperation. But knowing this truth and proving it were entirely different matters. Even if I shared my certainty with Magnus, what could I say? That I knew because I'd read about it in a novel from another world? That I had knowledge of future events that hadn't yet come to pass? I needed evidence, concrete, irrefutable proof that would convince even the most skeptical observer. And that meant finding a way beneath the central courtyard, regardless of Daedric's restrictions. A soft knock at my door pulled me from my thoughts. I opened it cautiously to find Ava standing outside, her expression troubled. I've been analyzing the energy readings from the observatory, she said as she entered. The pattern is unusual. Unusual how? I asked, closing the door behind her. She unfolded a diagram she created, showing the pulses of energy being channeled from the Red Sun. It's rhythmic, like a heartbeat, but with periodic surges of significantly higher intensity. Almost as if they're treating a patient, I suggested, maintaining a baseline of healing energy with occasional stronger treatments. Ava nodded. Exactly. And the frequency of these surges has been increasing over the past few months, according to the maintenance logs I accessed. Whatever they're healing, the process is accelerating. My blood ran cold. If the vampire monarch's healing was accelerating, it meant his return was drawing closer. The novel had never specified exactly when he would reawaken, only that the Southern Sea Sun Palace's fall would be the first sign of his return. "We may be running out of time," I said, careful not to reveal too much. "If they complete whatever they're doing before we gather sufficient evidence, then they'll have succeeded in hiding their activities from the Eastern continent," Ava finished grimly, "and will have no justification for further investigation or intervention." After Ava left, I stood by the window, staring at the red sun glowing in the night sky. Its crimson light bathed the palace grounds in an eerie glow, turning shadows into pools of darkness. Somewhere beneath the central courtyard, that same light was being channeled to heal the vampire monarch, preparing him for a return that would devastate the Eastern continent and beyond. I needed to act, but caution was essential. Charging ahead without evidence would accomplish nothing. Even Magnus, for all his power and influence, couldn't take action based solely on suspicion. The diplomatic consequences would be severe. Tomorrow would be our last chance. One way or another, we had to find what lay beneath the central courtyard. As I prepared for bed, I mentally reviewed our plans for the final day of investigation. Magnus would make one more formal request to access the central courtyard, which Daedric would almost certainly refuse. After that, our options would be limited. We could attempt another unauthorized exploration, but after our previous excursion to the observatory, security would likely be heightened. Whatever approach we took, the stakes couldn't be higher. This wasn't just about completing an investigation anymore. If my suspicions were correct, if the vampire monarch was indeed being healed beneath the Southern Sea Sun Palace, then what we discovered tomorrow could determine the fate of the entire Eastern continent. I just hoped we weren't already too late. Chapter 448. Confounding Love 1. There was something wrong with Arthur. Rachel didn't need evidence. She could read the signs like a weather map. She'd spent enough time watching nobles lie with practiced smiles and generals pretend they weren't bluffing to recognize when someone was off. And Arthur Nightingale? He was absolutely, definitely, unmistakably off. Not in the usual ways. His investigation team had produced far more results than all others combined, moving with surgical precision, almost too clean, too fast. As if he'd known exactly where to look. But Rachel knew Arthur better than most. She'd seen him in more moods than the Southern Sea had waves. This wasn't brilliance at work. This was brilliance hiding something. He was pulling away, subtly, like a planet shifting orbit. Still warm, still present, but distant in a way that made the back of her neck itch. She was a princess. She knew how to read a room. More importantly, she knew how to read him. The little silences. The way he smiled without his eyes joining in. How his gaze lingered just a second too long before snapping away. There was a crack somewhere behind his azure eyes, and whatever was leaking through wasn't healthy. And all of it pointed back to one person. Alisara. Rachel wasn't the jealous type, or rather, she was, but in the sophisticated, politically trained way that didn't involve throwing glasses or plotting assassinations. She could admit when someone was beautiful. And Alisara wasn't just beautiful. She was the kind of beautiful that rewrote standards. The kind of beautiful that made rooms quieter when she entered. But Arthur didn't chase after beauty. He wasn't driven by it. Something else was happening. Something deeper. Something colder. Rachel didn't like it. At all. "Welcome," she said as the door to her suite slid open and the others arrived. Cecilia Slatemark, Seraphina Zenith, and Rose Springshaper. All three walked in like storms wearing noble shoes. Dangerous in their own ways. Unstoppable when aligned. And the only reason they were aligning was currently investigating the palace like a man with a death wish. "There's something wrong with Arthur," Rachel said, skipping pleasantries entirely. The others didn't argue. Cecilia nodded first, sharp and immediate. "I noticed it too. His whole aura's changed. He looks like he's carrying something heavy," Rose added, sitting down with a frown. "Like he's halfway through drowning but still walking upright." "I saw it too," Seraphina said, voice cool and flat. He's not acting like himself. It's that woman, Cecilia muttered, her crimson eyes gleaming in a way that made furniture feel nervous. It started after she danced at the banquet. She's more than just a distraction, Rachel said. I'm fairly certain she's helping with his investigation somehow. That got the reaction she expected. Cecilia's eyes narrowed dangerously. Rose stiffened slightly. Serafina, however, didn't react, which, for her, was a reaction. How certain are you? Serafina asked. Half, Rachel admitted. Maybe more. I've seen movement near Arthur's wing that doesn't add up. Then it's true, Serafina said. The other two turned to her. I checked after their team started making too much progress, Serafina explained. There have been magical signatures in his quarters, faint but distinct. Someone's been visiting him. Rachel sat back, exhaling slowly. Alisara wasn't just getting close to Arthur. She was helping him, working with him, guiding him, maybe, and that meant this wasn't just about a pretty face or a suspicious dance. This was strategy. This was infiltration. And it was already working. But she's the advisor, Rose said, frowning like the title itself offended her. Why would she help an outsider? That's like a head diplomat handing over classified files because someone smiled at them the right way. It can't be because she likes him, Cecilia added, arms folded and voice sharp. Come on. No one falls that hard for someone in 2 days. Not unless they've been hit with a love curse or suffered a major concussion. You're telling me she'd risk her position, maybe even her life, for a crush? Absolutely ridiculous. Rachel exhaled, rubbing her temples. Cecilia's right. It makes no sense. Arthur doesn't flirt. Alisara doesn't act on whims. This isn't some whirlwind romance playing out like a bad serialized drama. It's something else. She looked around the room. 3 girls. 3 deadly talents. And every single one of them now very, very interested in protecting Arthur, even if they disagreed on how to do it. I need your help, Rachel said finally. We can't wait around for him to talk to us. He won't. So we're going to pull him out of that damn head of his. What do you mean? Rose asked. Rachel leaned forward, her voice low and conspiratorial as she laid out the plan. By the end of it, Rose's face had turned a deep shade of pink, somewhere between bashful and caught reading something forbidden. Cecilia was smiling the kind of smile that usually came before a coup, and Serafina, ever the composed one, gave a single nod, even though the tips of her pointed ears were very slightly red. It was time to act. The next morning, Arthur had just finished reviewing the previous day's findings and was clearly preparing to disappear into more work when the door to his temporary quarters slid open without so much as a knock. All 4 of them walked in like a perfectly coordinated ambush. Arthur, Rachel said sweetly. He looked up, wary. It was the sort of look you give an oncoming magical anomaly. Just enough curiosity to investigate, but plenty of healthy fear too. We've decided something, Cecilia announced, her tone brooking no argument. Arthur blinked. What is it now? You're taking a break today, Rose declared. He stared. What? It's an official off day from investigations, Serafina added, her voice calm but definitive. All teams are resting today before the final push tomorrow. I was going to spend the day compiling. No, Rachel interrupted, placing a hand on her hip. You've spent every free moment wrapped up in your thoughts or sneaking off to do who knows what. You need a break. So we're taking you out. Arthur stood, arms crossed, clearly preparing a tactical retreat. Out where? To explore the island, Cecilia said brightly. Enjoy the culture. Try the local cuisine. Look at the sights. Things normal people do when they visit other continents. I don't, he started, but they were already closing in. For girls. For corners. No exit. Rachel had stepped closer, smiling like a fox with a signed confession. Cecilia linked her arm with his, her grip warm and unyielding. Rose appeared at his other side and took his hand. Serafina simply stood behind him, radiating silent expectation. Arthur looked between them, visibly calculating whether he could outmaneuver all 4 without using magic and deciding the odds weren't good. He sighed. Fine. 1 hour. Rachel grinned. We were thinking 5. He looked like he was about to protest again, but then glanced at their faces, at the softness in Rose's eyes, the quiet force in Seraphina's, the mischievous glint in Cecilia's, and the stubborn determination in Rachel's, and he surrendered. All right, he said, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Let's go. As they led him from the room, Rachel caught Cecilia's eye. Phase 1 complete. Now for the hard part. Reminding Arthur there was more to life than mysterious pink-haired advisors and hidden chambers beneath the palace. Chapter 449. Confounding Love, 2. I wasn't sure what I'd done to deserve this ambush, but as we stepped into the bright sunlight outside the palace, I found myself, for the first time in days, taking a full breath. My captors, guides, had clearly planned this operation with military precision. Rose had somehow acquired a detailed map of the cultural district surrounding the palace, complete with annotations about the best local attractions. Seraphina, ever practical, had arranged for transportation. Rachel had secured permission for us to leave the palace grounds, which was no small feat given the current tensions. And Cecilia had that dangerous gleam in her eye that suggested she'd happily incinerate anyone who tried to interrupt our outing. You need to relax, Rachel said, linking her arm through mine as we boarded the sleek hover tram that would take us to the island's main marketplace. You've been wound so tight I'm surprised you haven't snapped. I've been busy, I protested weakly. Busy being obsessed, Cecilia corrected, settling into the seat across from me. There's investigating and then there's whatever you've been doing. You look like you haven't slept in days. She wasn't wrong. Between the investigation and everything else weighing on my mind, sleep had become something of a luxury. It's just the pressure, I said. Seraphina's cool gaze pinned me like a butterfly to a board. And you think working yourself to exhaustion will help you find the answers faster? Today, Rose interjected before I could respond, is about forgetting all of that, just for a few hours. The hover tram glided smoothly through the lush landscape that surrounded the palace. Unlike the heavily restricted areas we'd been investigating, this part of the island was alive with activity. Local residents moved about their daily business, their crimson-accented clothing marking them as palace citizens. Despite my initial reluctance, I found my attention drawn to the scenery. The Southern Sea Sun Palace Island was beautiful verdant forests interrupted by cascading waterfalls, all under the watchful glow of the red sun artifact that hovered perpetually in the sky. It's amazing, isn't it? Rose said, noticing my gaze. Despite everything, I can see why they're so protective of this place. It's their sanctuary, I agreed, thinking of the historical documents we'd found. They've been isolated for so long. They see outside influence as a threat. Today is not about investigation, Rachel reminded me firmly, giving my arm a gentle squeeze. No analysis, no theories, no mysterious chambers beneath courtyards. I raised an eyebrow. Been eavesdropping on our reports, have you? I have my sources, she replied with a confident smile that made her sapphire eyes sparkle. The marketplace was unlike anything I'd seen before. A vibrant explosion of colors, sounds, and scents that assaulted the senses. Vendors called out their wares in the local dialect, a singing cadence that made even mundane transactions sound like poetry. Strips of crimson silk fluttered overhead, strung between buildings to provide shade from the intense sun. Where do we start? I asked, momentarily overwhelmed by the options. Food, Cecilia declared, already steering me toward a row of stalls emitting particularly enticing aromas. You can't think properly on an empty stomach. We sampled our way through local delicacies. Spiced meat skewers, sweet pastries filled with a fruit I'd never encountered before, and a particularly potent tea that left my tongue tingling pleasantly. For the first time in days, I wasn't thinking about vampires or anything related to our investigation. I was simply present. You're smiling, Seraphina observed quietly as we moved through the crowded marketplace. It suits you better than the frown you've been wearing lately. I hadn't realized I was smiling. Hadn't realized how much I'd needed this. this simple moment of normality amid the gathering storm. "Thank you," I said, meeting her eyes genuinely. "All of you. I didn't know I needed this." "That's what we're here for," Rose said brightly, her warm hand finding mine. "To remind you when you're being too stubborn for your own good." "I'm not stubborn," I protested. All four of them laughed simultaneously, the sound so synchronized it was almost musical. "You're the definition of stubborn," Cecilia said, poking me playfully in the ribs. "Remember when you refused to admit you were injured after the duel with Ren? You were literally bleeding on the floor and still insisted you were perfectly fine. Or when you spent 3 days straight practicing that 6-circle spell because Jean said it couldn't be mastered in a week?" Rachel added, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "You nearly collapsed from mana exhaustion." "I did master it, though," I pointed out with a grin. "That's not the point," Rose exclaimed, but she was smiling too. Cecilia slipped her arm through mine on the opposite side from Rachel. "The point is that you push yourself too hard. Always have." I glanced between them, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. "I'm fine, really." "Sure you are," Rachel said, not believing me for a second. "That's why you've been wandering around like a ghost for the past few days. Quiet and distracted," Serafina added, her normally stoic expression softening slightly. "With that faraway look in your eyes," Rose finished. I felt a warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with the island's tropical climate. They'd noticed, all of them, and they cared enough to stage this intervention. As the day progressed, I found myself relaxing more and more. We visited a local artisan's workshop where Serafina purchased an elegant silver hairpin. We watched street performers execute impossible feats of magic and acrobatics. We wandered through a garden of flowers that changed color depending on who was viewing them. To me, they appeared in every shade of blue imaginable. "They reflect your soul's resonance," a local guide explained when I asked about the phenomenon. "Each person sees something different." "What do you see?" I asked Rachel, who stood beside me. "Gold," she said softly. "Every possible shade, from pale yellow to deep amber." "I see crimson," Cecilia added, her eyes reflecting the same hue as she leaned against my shoulder. "Silver and blue," was Serafina's quiet response. "Pink and white," Rose said with a gentle smile. I looked back at the flowers, wondering what it meant that they appeared blue to me. Whatever the case, it was a welcome distraction from the darkness that had consumed my thoughts these past days. As afternoon turned to evening, we found ourselves in a quieter section of the cultural district, where lanterns were being lit along the streets in preparation for nightfall. "One last stop before we head back," Rachel announced, guiding us toward a small, unassuming building nestled between two larger shops. "What's this?" I asked, noting the strange symbols painted around the doorway. "A fortune teller," Cecilia said with a mischievous grin. "Apparently quite famous on the island. Locals say she can see through time itself." I raised an eyebrow skeptically. "You don't really believe that, do you?" "Of course not," Cecilia scoffed. "But it'll be fun. Unless you're scared." The challenge in her eyes was impossible to resist. "Lead the way, then." Chapter 450. Confounding Love, 3. The interior of the fortune teller's shop enveloped us in a world apart from the vibrant marketplace outside. Heavy velvet curtains in deep crimson and purple draped the walls, muffling sound and creating an atmosphere of intimate secrecy. The air was thick with incense, sandalwood, and something more exotic I couldn't quite identify. Crystal specimens of various sizes caught and refracted the flickering light from dozens of candles scattered throughout the space. The fortune teller herself was a surprisingly elegant woman. Despite her apparent age, she carried herself with remarkable poise. Her silver hair was woven with small charms and beads that clicked softly when she moved, and her eyes, a striking amber color in the dim light, seemed to take in everything at once. "Welcome," she greeted us, gesturing to the circular table at the center of the room. "I am Madame Vesta. Please, be seated." We arranged ourselves around the table, the girls exchanging excited glances while I maintained my skepticism. The fortune teller settled into her chair and withdrew an ornate deck of cards from a silk-wrapped bundle. "These cards speak to me," she explained, her fingers deftly shuffling the deck with practiced ease. "They reveal truths hidden from ordinary sight, paths taken and not taken, wounds healed and still bleeding, futures waiting to unfold." "I'll go first," Rachel volunteered, leaning forward with an eagerness that surprised me. For someone so practical, she seemed unusually interested in this mystical display. Madame Vesta nodded. Spreading the cards in a graceful arc, "Choose 4 cards that call to you, Princess of the North." Rachel's eyebrows rose slightly at the use of her title, something we hadn't mentioned, but she complied, letting her fingers hover over the spread before selecting 4 cards. The fortune teller arranged them in a cross pattern and turned them over one by one. "The Queen of Swords," she announced, revealing the first card. "Your mind is sharp as the blade she wields. You see through deception, cutting away falsehoods to reach truth." Rachel's lips curved in a slight smile. The assessment wasn't inaccurate. The 10 of Cups. The second card showed a family beneath a rainbow of cups. This represents what you truly seek, not just power or position, but genuine connection. Emotional fulfillment that wealth cannot buy. The third card depicted a seated woman with a scroll, her face serene and knowing. The High Priestess. Your intuition runs deeper than you acknowledge. You sense things others miss, even when your eyes are closed. The final card showed a man standing between 2 wands, looking out at the horizon. The 2 of Wands. You stand at a crossroads, Princess. Soon you must choose between the path of security and one of uncertain adventure. Rachel sat back, her expression thoughtful. "Interesting," was all she said, but I could see the fortune teller's words had resonated with her. "I'll go next," Cecilia declared, her tone suggesting she viewed this more as entertainment than divination. She selected her cards with decisive gestures, almost challenging the deck to reveal something meaningful. "The Queen of Wands," Madame Vesta said, turning over a card showing a woman with a sunflower and a black cat. "Fire burns in your soul, Princess of the Empire. Your presence commands attention. Your passion inspires others." Cecilia smirked, clearly pleased with this assessment. The Emperor, reversed. The next card showed a regal figure on a throne, but upside down. You struggle with questions of control and authority. Perhaps not all battles can be won through sheer force of will. Her smirk faded slightly. 5 of Swords. This card depicted a man gathering swords while others walked away defeated. Beware of victories that cost too much. Not all conflicts are worth the price of winning them. The fortune teller's gaze was direct as she turned over the final card. Strength. Your true power lies not in domination but in the gentle command of your own nature. The lion is tamed not by force, but by patience and inner resolve. Cecilia's crimson eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you saying I'm out of control?" "The cards say only what needs to be heard," Madame Vesta replied calmly. "What you choose to hear is your decision alone." Serafina, who had been watching silently, now reached for the cards. Her selection was methodical, each choice appearing carefully considered. 8 of Pentacles. The fortune teller began. The card showed a craftsman working diligently on his creations. Your dedication to mastery serves you well. You perfect your skills with patience and precision. Serafina nodded slightly, accepting this as a simple truth. 4 of Swords. This card depicted a knight resting. Even the sharpest mind must rest to maintain its edge. There is wisdom in stillness that cannot be found in constant striving. The Hermit. A robed figure holding a lantern in darkness. Solitude has been both your teacher and your prison. You carry your own light, but sometimes illuminate only your own path. The final card showed children playing among cups. 6 of Cups. Look to forgotten joy and simplicity. They hold wisdom your discipline alone cannot reach. Serafina's expression remained composed, but I noticed her fingers brush unconsciously against the silver hairpin she'd purchased earlier. Something in the reading had touched her. Rose hesitated before selecting her cards, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the spread. "Don't worry," Rachel encouraged her. "It's just for fun." Rose nodded and made her selections. The fortune teller's expression shifted subtly as she arranged the cards. "Page of Cups," she began. The card showed a young person with a cup containing a fish. "Your heart speaks truths others cannot hear. You possess emotional wisdom beyond your years." Nine of Pentacles. A woman stood in a lush garden. "The garden you've cultivated blooms with your independence. You have built your own sanctuary from that which sought to contain you." Rose's eyes widened slightly at this. Seven of Cups, reversed. The card showed cups filled with various symbols, but upside down. The mists of confusion are clearing. What once seemed like multiple paths reveals itself as illusion. Madame Vesta paused before turning the final card, studying Rose with unusual intensity. "The sun," she said finally. "Light after darkness. The warmth of clarity after the cold shadow of deception." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Your mother's chains cannot bind you forever. The cult's legacy ends with you, if you choose it." Rose paled visibly, her hands clenching in her lap. "How did you?" "The cards know what the heart conceals," Madame Vesta said gently. "Your path leads toward healing, not repetition." A tense silence fell over the table. "Your turn, Arthur," Rachel said, breaking the uncomfortable moment. I hesitated, then reached for the cards, selecting four that seemed to draw my attention despite my skepticism. Madame Vesta's hands stilled momentarily as she turned over the first card. "The tower reversed," she said. The card showed a tower struck by lightning, people falling from it, but upside down. "You resist a necessary breakdown of false structures. Sometimes destruction is the only path to truth." The second card showed a naked figure in a wreath. "The world, completion of a cycle, wholeness across different realms. You stand at a junction where endings and beginnings converge." "Death." Despite its ominous name, the card depicted a scene of transformation. Not literal death, but metamorphosis. The shedding of an old self to make way for the new. The final card showed a figure about to step off a cliff. "The Fool. A leap of faith awaits you. Innocence restored through wisdom hard-won." Madame Vesta studied the pattern before her, then looked up at me with an intensity that made me shift uncomfortably. "You stand at a crossroads between worlds," she said, her voice taking on a rhythmic cadence. "Fighting against revelations that must come. The completion you seek is within reach, but only through transformation can you begin anew." Two souls intertwined across realities, one journey ending as another begins. A chill ran down my spine. Her words felt too specific, too close to the truth I'd been grappling with. The others were watching me with varied expressions of curiosity and concern. "That's quite poetic," I managed to say, trying to maintain my skeptical facade. Madame Vesta smiled, a knowing expression that suggested she saw right through my pretense. "The cards speak in poetry because some truths are too complex for ordinary language." She gathered the cards back into her deck with practiced motions. "You carry burdens not meant for one person alone," she said, looking around at all of us. "Remember that sharing the weight does not diminish your strength. It multiplies it." "Well, that was unexpectedly intense," Cecilia commented, breaking the silence as we made our way back toward the tram station. "She knew things she shouldn't have known," Rose said softly, her eyes still troubled. "About my mother." Rachel put an arm around Rose's shoulders. "Fortune tellers are good at reading people. She probably picked up on subtle cues." "Perhaps," Serafina agreed, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that Madame Vesta had seen far more than she should have been able to. Her invitation to return at midnight lingered in my thoughts. Did she truly know something about my connection to Alisara? About Emma? The girls were watching me, their expressions varying degrees of concerned and curious. "What do you think, Arthur?" Rachel asked. Was she the real deal or just good at cold reading? I forced a casual shrug. Probably a bit of both. She certainly knew how to create an atmosphere. As we boarded the tram back to the palace, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. The day had been a welcome respite from the intensity of the investigation, a chance to simply enjoy the company of these four remarkable women. But the fortune-teller's words had brought me back to the reality I'd been trying to escape, the mystery of Alisara, the looming threat of the vampire monarch, and the truth about my own existence in this world. Chapter 451. Dia Solarin 1. Lucifer intended to find the girl he saw at the banquet. The girl who seemed around his age, the palace lord's daughter and a very strong talent. So, taking this break day as his chance, he did. He chose to approach her in order to find the necessary evidence against the Southern Sea Sun Palace due to how far behind his and other investigation groups were from Arthur's. The sound of steel cutting through air drew his attention as he passed a secluded courtyard. Quick, precise strikes followed by moments of stillness, then another flurry of movement. Someone was training, and with remarkable discipline. He paused at the entrance, observing without announcing himself. The courtyard was small but elegant, ringed by crimson-leaved maples and equipped with training dummies and weapon racks. At its center stood a young woman with hair the color of fresh blood and eyes as golden as real gold, wielding a slender rapier with practiced precision. Dia Solarin. Her movements were fluid yet forceful, each strike flowing into the next with a rhythm that spoke of years of dedicated practice. She wore simple training garments rather than the elaborate robes typical of palace nobility, her hair tied back in a practical style that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. What struck him most was the intensity of her focus. While his own training often attracted an audience, something he'd grown accustomed to over the years, Dia moved as if performing for no one, each strike executed with the same dedication whether observed or not. True mastery, his father would have said, was found in the movements made when no one was watching. Lucifer stepped into the courtyard, deliberately scuffing his boot to announce his presence rather than startling her. Dia paused mid-thrust, her golden eyes flicking toward him with a wariness that seemed excessive for someone in her position. "My apologies for the intrusion," he said, keeping his tone respectful and neutral. "I was assigned to inspect the training facilities." Dia lowered her rapier but didn't sheath it. "This area isn't part of the public training facilities," she replied. Her voice was cool but not outright hostile. "It's a private courtyard, Your Highness." "Then I've overstepped," Lucifer acknowledged with a slight bow. "I'll continue elsewhere." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "You're Lucifer Windward, the prince of the northern continent and rank 1 among all the students who come here." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "I am." Dia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Your strength at your age is incredible. Few can hope to reach high integration rank." The compliment was unexpected. "Thank you," he replied. "Your swordplay shows similar dedication." A flicker of something, pride, wariness, crossed her features. "We have different standards here than in the East. What you witnessed was merely basic form practice, and I doubt it's little more than child's play in your eyes." "Nothing about your technique is merely basic," Lucifer countered. He stepped further into the courtyard, moving toward one of the weapon racks. "Your control is exceptional, particularly in the transition between strikes." Dia watched him with narrowed eyes as he examined the training weapons. The rack held an assortment of practice blades. Wooden, blunted steel, even a few crafted from specialized materials designed to handle magical enhancement. "Your investigation concludes soon," she said abruptly. "Then you and your companions will return." Lucifer nodded, picking up a wooden practice sword and testing its balance. "That's the arrangement, yes? And what have you discovered?" "In your thorough investigation." There was a subtle edge to her words, a challenge beneath the polite inquiry. He turned to face her fully. "I suspect you already know the answer to that." "Do I?" "Your father has been remarkably effective at redirecting our efforts. Every time we find something interesting, we're reassigned or restricted." He replaced the wooden sword on the rack. "It's almost as if the Southern Sea Sun Palace has something to hide." Dia's posture stiffened. All nations have their secrets. The East is no different. True, Lucifer conceded. But most nations don't go to such lengths to conceal them. For a moment, they regarded each other in silence. Dia was the first to look away, returning to her practice stance. If you'll excuse me, I need to continue my training. Rather than leaving, Lucifer moved to another part of the courtyard and began his own warm-up exercises. He didn't look directly at Dia, but he could feel her attention on him, her rhythm disrupted by his presence. After several minutes of stretching and basic forms, he spoke again. The palace's isolation has preserved many traditional techniques that have been lost or modified elsewhere. It would be educational to observe more of your training methods before we depart, especially since you are a genius. Dia executed a complex series of thrusts before responding. There are scrolls in the Eastern Library documenting our basic forms. You can request access if you're genuinely interested in scholarship. Scrolls can't demonstrate the practical application, Lucifer pointed out. They can't show the subtle adjustments, the weight distribution, the timing. She paused, lowering her rapier slightly. Why are you really here, Lucifer Windward? This courtyard isn't on any official map of the palace. You didn't simply stumble across it. It was a fair question. The truth that he had indeed found it by chance seemed less credible than any fabrication he might offer. I followed the sound of your training, he said simply. Good swordplay has a distinctive rhythm, and the way your sword sang from your sword resonance was simply brilliant. Dia's eyes narrowed skeptically. And your interest is purely academic, I suppose? My interest is in understanding, Lucifer replied. Not just techniques, but the people who practice them. The Southern Sea Sun Palace has remained isolated for centuries, yet maintained a tradition of martial excellence as seen here. That suggests a culture that values strength even in the absence of external challenges. We value strength because we understand its necessity, Dia said, her voice suddenly fierce. The world beyond our shores has rarely shown kindness to those who cannot defend themselves. The intensity of her response caught him off guard. There was history there, personal, not just political. Of course, he knew all about it. The Viserians who crushed the pride of the palace when they tried to reach into the southern continent and more. On that, we agree, he said quietly. Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. For the first time, her expression held genuine curiosity rather than guarded suspicion. Your family name, the Windwards. I heard they hold the same level of strength as the Viserians. Dia asked. Lucifer nodded. Viserians of the south with their draconic flames and spearmanship, and the Windwards of the north with their swordsmanship steeped deep in ice magic were compared against each other more often than not. I am an exception among my family, though, Lucifer felt the need to add. Dia seemed to accept this, understanding where it came from. She resumed her practice, though her movements now seemed more demonstration than true training. Your form is excellent, Lucifer observed after watching for several minutes. But you favor your right side on defensive maneuvers. Against an opponent who recognizes the pattern, it could become a vulnerability. She stopped mid-motion, turning to face him fully. You presume to critique my technique after a few minutes of observation? Not critique, he clarified. Observe. The difference is significant. Dia's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of interest in her eyes. And how would you suggest addressing this supposed vulnerability? Lucifer stepped forward, drawing one of the practice swords from the rack. Through practical application. Theory only takes us so far. You're suggesting we spar? There was disbelief in her voice, but also, he thought, a hint of intrigue. I am. He took a basic ready stance, the wooden sword held loosely in his hand. Unless you believe training alone will adequately prepare you for real combat. Her eyes narrowed. You're very presumptuous for a guest in my home. Perhaps, he acknowledged with a slight smile. But am I wrong? Dia considered him for a long moment, her crimson eyes calculating. Then, with a decisive motion, she sheathed her rapier and moved to the weapon rack, selecting a practice sword that matched his own. Very well, she said. stepping into the center of the courtyard. But understand this, in the Southern Sea Sun Palace, we don't hold back simply because someone is a visitor. Lucifer's smile widened as he moved to face her. I would expect nothing less. As they circled each other, wooden blades raised. He realized this was the first genuine interaction he'd had with any member of the palace since their arrival. No diplomatic facades, no carefully constructed misdirection. Just two warriors preparing to test their skill against one another. Sometimes, Lucifer reflected, the most direct path to truth ran through the clash of blades rather than words. Chapter 452. Dia Solarin, 2. Wood met wood with a crystalline ring as Lucifer and Dia circled each other in the secluded courtyard. Though they wielded practiced swords, both had infused their weapons with enough resonance to create the distinctive sound of true combat. Dia struck first, a lightning-fast thrust aimed at Lucifer's left shoulder. He parried with a controlled flick of his wrist, the economy of his movement betraying years of relentless training. They separated, reset, and engaged again. Your style is interesting, Lucifer observed as they exchanged a series of probing attacks. His verdant eyes tracked her movements with calm precision. Elements of traditional Eastern fencing, but with unique flourishes I haven't seen before. Dia moved like flowing water, her footwork precise and light. The Southern Sea Sun Palace preserved techniques that were lost when the Eastern schools standardized their approaches, she replied, seamlessly transitioning from defense to offense with a diagonal slash. Lucifer sidestepped rather than parrying, allowing her blade to pass harmlessly by. His movements carried the effortless grace of someone born to nobility but tempered through genuine discipline. The diversity benefits you. It makes your patterns less predictable. For several minutes, they continued their dance of blades, each testing the other's defenses without committing fully to an attack. Lucifer maintained a pleasant exterior, his expression open yet focused, a stark contrast to Dia's intense concentration. There was something magnetic about his presence, a natural charisma that made even this combat exercise feel somehow lighter. Dia's golden eyes narrowed as she struggled to find an opening in Lucifer's defense. His movements were frustratingly efficient, with no wasted energy or telegraphed intentions. Every time she thought she'd spotted a weakness, it vanished before she could exploit it. You're holding back, she accused after another exchange ended in stalemate. A warm smile touched Lucifer's lips. So are you. Something shifted in Dia's expression, a decision made. Her next series of attacks came faster, her blade humming with increased resonance as she channeled more mana into her strikes. The practiced sword glowed faintly with crimson energy, leaving trailing arcs of light as it cut through the air. Lucifer met her heightened intensity with his own, though his demeanor remained remarkably unruffled. His sword resonance manifested as a subtle shimmering along his blade, neither flashy nor overwhelming, but perfectly controlled. Each clash now released small bursts of energy, sparking between their weapons like miniature lightning storms. As the spar intensified, Lucifer's god's eyes activated naturally, a response to the increasing challenge. The legendary gift of the Windward royal line shone through, his verdant eyes taking on a faint luminescence as their perceptive abilities sharpened dramatically. The world around him seemed to slow fractionally, details becoming crystal clear. He could track the minute adjustments in Dia's footwork, the subtle shifts in her balance that telegraphed her next move before she made it. Dia's eyes narrowed. She quickly came to a conclusion. She would need her gift. With a sudden backstep, Dia created distance between them. A miniature sun formed, no larger than an apple, but burning with intense crimson energy that matched her eyes. The temperature in the courtyard rose noticeably as the tiny star pulsed with controlled power. The Solarin gift, Lucifer observed, his voice carrying genuine appreciation rather than competitive assessment. I didn't expect you to reveal it in a practice match. Dia's expression remained focused. Consider it professional courtesy. You've shown me yours. The miniature sun orbited her like a satellite, its gravitational field subtle but noticeable in the way it affected the air around them. When she moved, it followed, maintaining a constant distance from her body. Lucifer responded by activating his first gift fully. The Yin-Yang body was a rare gift, considered among the best in the world. Black and white mana swirled around him in a double helix, the energies distinct yet perfectly balanced, reflecting his internal harmony. 2 gifts. Dia couldn't hide her surprise. That's ridiculous. Lucifer nodded, his expression modest despite the impressive display. The northern climate tends to foster unusual manifestations. The balance helps regulate my ice affinity. Impressive, Dia acknowledged. The harmonization of opposing forces. Few can maintain such equilibrium. Their next exchange was on another level entirely. Dia incorporated her miniature sun into her swordplay, using its gravitational pull to alter the trajectory of her strikes in ways that would be impossible through physical means alone. Her blade would begin a predictable arc, only to curve unexpectedly as the sun's gravity bent its path. Against an ordinary opponent, such techniques would be overwhelmingly effective. But Lucifer's god's eyes tracked not just the blade but the shifting gravitational fields themselves. The black and white mana surrounding him responded to his needs without conscious direction, strengthening his defenses where needed and enhancing his counters. For a full minute, they engaged in a flurry of strikes too fast for an ordinary observer to follow. The practiced swords, reinforced by their respective energies, withstood forces that would have shattered ordinary steel. Neither gained a decisive advantage, though both landed glancing blows that were deflected before they could score cleanly. Then Lucifer saw it, the pattern in her movements, the slight hesitation when transitioning from her third form to her fourth. He waited, counting the rhythm of her strikes, and when the moment came, he moved. A feint to her right drew her expected response. As she shifted to counter, Lucifer's blade was already changing direction, slipping past her guard with millimeter precision. He stopped the edge a hair's breadth from her throat, his control absolute. Silence fell over the courtyard. Dia froze, her golden eyes wide with disbelief. The miniature sun above her shoulder pulsed once, then dimmed slightly as she processed what had happened. "How?" she asked, genuine curiosity replacing competitiveness in her voice. Lucifer lowered his blade, his smile warm and free of condescension. "Your fourth form transition leaves a momentary opening, almost imperceptible, but present. No one has ever caught that before," she said, stepping back and dismissing her gift. The miniature sun compressed into a point of light before vanishing completely. "Few would have the opportunity to study it closely," Lucifer replied, his own god's eyes fading as he relaxed his stance. The black and white mana around him dissipated like morning mist. "Your skill is exceptional. With the right challenges, you could become truly formidable." Something flickered across Dia's expression, a mixture of pride and what might have been longing. The Southern Sea Sun Palace offers limited opportunities for growth through competition. Isolation has its costs. Lucifer agreed, his tone gentle rather than judgmental. "Even the strongest blade dulls without a whetstone." Dia moved to return her practiced sword to the rack, her movements betraying a new awareness of him. The wariness remained, but it was now tempered with respect. "Tomorrow is your final day of investigation," she began, her voice becoming more practical. "You'll have more important matters to attend to than training exercises." "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but we begin early. I could return here at dawn, before the day's official activities commence." Dia considered the offer, her practical nature clearly weighing the benefits against potential risks. "Dawn," she said finally. "1 hour, no more. And we focus on practical application, not political discussion." "Agreed," Lucifer replied with a slight bow, his natural grace making even this simple gesture seem elegant. "Though I find that blades often reveal more truth than diplomatic exchanges ever could." As he turned to leave, he sensed a shift in Dia's demeanor, a subtle relaxation, as if some internal barrier had lowered fractionally. "Lucifer," she called as he reached the courtyard entrance. When he looked back, her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes held a new intensity. "Whatever you and your companions discover tomorrow, proceed with caution. Even I don't know what is being hidden. The warning was unexpected, especially from the daughter of the palace's lord. Before he could respond, she had already turned away, resuming her solitary practice with renewed focus. Lucifer paused at the threshold, watching her for a moment longer. Chapter 453. Dia Solarin 3. The eastern sky had barely begun to lighten when Lucifer arrived at the secluded courtyard. Dawn mist clung to the ground in wispy tendrils, giving the training area an ethereal quality as it emerged from darkness. He had deliberately arrived early, using the quiet moments to center himself through a series of breathing exercises. When Dia appeared, she moved with the silent grace of someone accustomed to navigating their world unnoticed. Her crimson hair was tied back simply, her training clothes practical rather than ornamental. She paused briefly upon seeing him already there, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "You're punctual," she said by way of greeting. Lucifer smiled, the expression warming his face in the cool morning air. "A habit my instructors spent years drilling into me. The first prince can never be late, even to his own execution." The quip drew a slight curve to Dia's lips as she moved toward the weapon rack. "An execution seems an extreme consequence for tardiness." "My father would disagree," Lucifer replied lightly, though there was an undercurrent of truth to his words. Windward discipline is renowned for a reason. They selected practice swords, the same ones they had used yesterday, and moved to the center of the courtyard. This time, there was less ceremony to their preparations, a familiarity that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. "Shall we begin where we left off?" Lucifer suggested. "That transition between your third and fourth forms?" Dia nodded, her golden eyes holding his for a moment longer than necessary. "I spent the evening analyzing it. I believe I see the flaw now." She demonstrated the sequence, moving deliberately to highlight the particular moment Lucifer had exploited. Her form was already different, more fluid, the hesitation all but eliminated. "You adjusted quickly," he observed, genuine admiration in his voice. "When one trains alone, one learns to be one's own harshest critic," she replied. She reset her stance, repeating the sequence with subtle variations. "My father has little time for swordplay instruction these days. His duties consume him." There was something in her tone, not bitterness exactly, but resignation. Lucifer picked up on it immediately. "It must be challenging," he said carefully, "carrying the Solaran legacy largely on your own." Dia's movements paused fractionally before continuing. "My father believes a woman's role is primarily to continue the bloodline, not to lead." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed deeper feelings. "My training is tolerated, not encouraged." Lucifer's brows furrowed slightly. "That seems short-sighted, given your obvious talent." "Tradition often is." She launched into a more complex series of movements, her practice blade whistling through the air. "The Lord of the Southern Sea Sun Palace has always been male. The Red Sun's power passes through the male line, or so the old texts claim. And yet your gift manifests as impressively as any I've seen," Lucifer countered, moving to mirror her stance. "Perhaps the old texts deserve re-examination." They began to spar lightly, their blades meeting in a controlled rhythm that allowed for conversation between exchanges. It was less a competition than a dialogue expressed through movement. "What of you?" Dia asked after several minutes of practice. "The first prince of the northern continent, training at Mythos Academy. That seems unconventional." Lucifer parried a thrust, his god's eyes activating briefly to track a particularly quick sequence. "My father believes in practical experience over sheltered training," a half-truth that came easily to his lips. "And Mythos offers opportunities to test one's abilities against peers from across the globe." "Against people like Arthur Nightingale?" Dia inquired, her tone casual but her eyes watchful. Something flickered across Lucifer's expression, a complexity not often visible beneath his natural charm. "Arthur is exceptional." "You admire him," she observed. Lucifer's blade lowered slightly as he considered his response. He represents something I've struggled with for years, he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. The expectation of heroism. Dia lowered her sword as well, sensing the conversation had shifted to something more significant than their training. Heroism. The prophecies speak of a second hero who will rise, Lucifer explained, his verdant eyes distant. For as long as I can remember, that destiny has hung over me like a storm cloud due to my talent from a young age. And Arthur challenges this expectation? Dia asked perceptively. Lucifer laughed softly, the sound tinged with self-deprecation. Arthur embodies everything a hero should be, without even trying. He fights for others instinctively, sacrifices without hesitation, faces impossible odds with unwavering determination. He shook his head. Meanwhile, You doubt your worthiness? Dia finished for him when he trailed off. His eyes met hers, startled by her insight. Yes, though it's not something I typically discuss with diplomatic counterparts. We're hardly operating in official capacities at the moment, Dia pointed out, gesturing to their training attire and the private courtyard. Then, more softly, and sometimes it's easier to share truths with someone who hasn't known you your whole life. There was understanding in her voice that resonated with him. A shared experience of expectations and doubts. My siblings are 10 years younger than me, Lucifer said, resuming a basic stance to continue their practice. Twins, a boy and a girl. Sometimes I wonder if they'll face the same pressures. Dia matched his stance, their swords meeting in a gentle clash. You feel protective of them. Fiercely, he admitted. They deserve to choose their own paths, not have destiny thrust upon them as I did. Choice is a luxury many of us in positions of power rarely experience, Dia observed, her movements flowing more naturally now, as if their conversation had somehow freed her body as well as her words. My father is ready to marry me off and groom my first son to inherit his position since I was a child. Despite my gift being stronger, despite my dedication to our traditions. Because you're female, Lucifer said, not as a question. Because I'm female, she confirmed, her blade flashing with sudden intensity before she regained control. And because I've begun to question aspects of our isolation that he considers sacrosanct. This admission, clearly not something she shared lightly, hung in the air between them. Lucifer recognized the significance of her trust. What aspects? He asked carefully. Dia executed a complex maneuver before answering, her miniature sun flickering into existence above her shoulder, casting her face in crimson light. My father believes our isolation protects us, that the outside world would destroy what makes the Southern Sea Sun Palace unique. The tiny star pulsed with her emotions. But I've studied our history. We weren't always cut off from the world. We once had diplomatic ties, trading relationships, cultural exchanges. It's difficult to stand in the shadow of a legacy you can't fully see, he said softly. As difficult as standing in the light of a prophecy you don't feel worthy of, she returned, understanding flowing between them. Their sparring had evolved into something more like a dance, their movements synchronized despite the weighty conversation. The yin-yang body gift activated around Lucifer, its black and white mana swirling in harmony with Dia's miniature sun as they circled each other. Do you believe in destiny, Lucifer Windward? Dia asked suddenly, her blade coming to rest against his in a perfect cross. The question caught him off guard, but he answered honestly. I believe in choices. Even within the constraints of prophecy or tradition, we always have choices. What if the choices before us lead to betrayal, either of others or ourselves? Her voice had grown quieter, more intense. Then we choose what we can live with, he replied, his verdant eyes holding hers steadily. And hope for understanding from those who matter. Something shifted in Dia's expression. A softening, a vulnerability rarely permitted to surface. For a moment, she wasn't the daughter of the Southern Sea Sun Palace's lord, but simply a young woman carrying burdens too heavy for her shoulders alone. Impulsively, Lucifer lowered his sword completely and reached out, his fingers lightly brushing against hers where they gripped her weapon. The contact was brief, almost imperceptible, but the gesture spoke volumes. "Today is your final day here," Dia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he confirmed. "What happens after you leave?" The question carried layers of meaning about the investigation, about what might be discovered, about this unexpected connection between them. Lucifer's smile returned, though tempered with something more serious than his usual radiance. "That depends on what we find today, and on what choices are made afterward." Dia nodded, understanding the unspoken complexities. She stepped back, resuming her practiced stance, but something had changed between them. A trust had formed, fragile but real. As dawn fully broke over the palace, casting long golden rays across the courtyard, they continued their dance of blades. But now, with each exchange, they shared not just techniques but pieces of themselves. Two souls finding unexpected resonance amid a palace of secrets. Chapter 454. Alisara Velcroix, 1. It was the last day of investigation already and things weren't looking good for us. The investigation really hadn't revealed much and I was going blank, trying to determine what to do in order to achieve my goal. Problem was that I had no idea. I stood on a secluded balcony overlooking the central courtyard, the weight of our impending failure pressing down on me like a physical force. Tomorrow we would depart the Southern Sea Sun Palace, leaving behind whatever secrets it held, including the vampire monarch I was increasingly certain lay somewhere beneath our feet, drawing power from the red sun to heal. Without evidence, I couldn't convince even Magnus to take action. The diplomatic consequences of accusing the palace of harboring vampires without proof would be catastrophic. "You look troubled, Arthur Nightingale." I didn't need to turn to recognize that voice, smooth as silk and just as deceptive. Alisara had appeared once again, her ability to find me when I was alone growing more unsettling by the day. "Just contemplating our lack of progress," I replied, keeping my tone neutral as I turned to face her. She was dressed more simply today, in flowing robes of deep crimson that made her pink hair seem even more vibrant by contrast. Her cyan green eyes studied me with that unsettling mixture of familiarity and predatory interest. "Perhaps you're looking in the wrong places," she suggested, moving to stand beside me at the balcony rail, close enough that I could catch the faint scent of jasmine that seemed to follow her. "And where should I be looking?" I asked, unable to keep a hint of frustration from my voice. Her lips curved into a secretive smile. "Beneath the surface. Always beneath the surface." "You've been helping me," I said, making it a statement rather than a question, guiding me toward clues, leaving breadcrumbs. "Why?" Alisara turned to gaze out at the courtyard, her expression momentarily distant. "I don't know," she admitted, and for once, she sounded genuinely uncertain. "I feel as though I should, as though there's something about you that demands my attention, my assistance." "We're strangers," I pointed out. "You've known me less than 2 weeks. Why risk your position, your relationship with Daedric, to help an outsider investigating your home?" She laughed softly, the sound sending an involuntary shiver down my spine. "Are we strangers, Arthur? Sometimes I'm not so certain." I studied her profile, searching for any hint of deception. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying," she began, then paused, seeming to struggle with her words for the first time since I'd met her. "I'm saying that when I look at you, I feel something I can't explain. A connection, a recognition, as if I've known you in another life." My heart thudded heavily in my chest. This was dangerous territory. If Alisara truly was Emma somehow reborn or transformed, engaging with that truth directly could lead down paths I wasn't prepared to follow. Not while the investigation remained unresolved. "That sounds mystical for a political advisor," I said carefully. "Perhaps I'm more than just an advisor," she replied, her eyes meeting mine with unsettling intensity. "Perhaps I'm something no one here truly understands, least of all myself." There was something vulnerable in her admission, a crack in the confident facade she typically presented. For a moment, I glimpsed something beneath the surface of Alisara Velcroix, something that reminded me painfully of Emma. "What do you want from me?" I asked quietly. What an interesting question, she mused, tilting her head as she considered me. What I want is complicated, but what I can offer you is quite simple. Access. Access to what? To the central courtyard. To what lies beneath it. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Tonight, when the red sun reaches its zenith, the central chamber will be accessible. Daedric will be occupied with preparations for your departure. The guards will be at minimum strength. I stared at her, struggling to understand her motives. Why would you betray your lord like this? Betrayal assumes loyalty, she replied, her smile turning sharp. My loyalties are fluid, and currently, something in me wishes to help you, Arthur Nightingale. At what cost? There had to be a price. There always was. Alisara's gaze roamed my face, lingering on my eyes in a way that made me feel exposed. No cost. Not yet. Consider it an investment in our relationship. The way she said relationship carried implications I wasn't comfortable exploring. Whatever connection existed between us, whether due to Emma or something else entirely, it was tangled with dangers I couldn't fully comprehend. You're playing a dangerous game, I observed. All games worth playing are dangerous, she countered. The question is whether you're willing to play. I weighed my options carefully. Alisara's offer was my best chance to discover the truth, but trusting her felt like walking blindfolded along a cliff edge. Yet what choice did I have? Without evidence, the investigation would end in failure, and the vampire monarch would continue growing stronger. How would I access the central chamber? I asked finally. Her smile widened, triumph glinting in her eyes. There's a maintenance entrance on the eastern side of the courtyard. It appears to be sealed, but the wards are illusory. Press the third stone from the bottom, where the red sun symbol is carved, and the passage will open. And the guards will be otherwise occupied at precisely midnight. Her confidence suggested she'd already arranged for this distraction, whatever it might be. I should have questioned her further, should have demanded to know why she was really helping me. But the opportunity was too critical to risk with excessive caution. If this is a trap, I began. It isn't, she interrupted. Not for you, at least. Before I could respond, she reached out, her fingertips lightly brushing my cheek in a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. For an instant, her eyes seemed to soften, to become almost wistful. You remind me of someone, she said quietly. Someone I can't quite remember, but who feels important. I remained still, afraid that any movement might shatter this moment of vulnerability. Who? Alisara withdrew her hand, her expression closing off once more. That's the question, isn't it? Perhaps tonight, we'll both find answers we're seeking. She turned to leave, her robes swirling around her like liquid crimson. At the doorway, she paused, looking back over her shoulder. Midnight, Arthur. Don't be late. After she was gone, I remained on the balcony, my thoughts in turmoil. Alisara's offer seemed too perfect, too convenient. Yet her momentary vulnerability had felt genuine in a way that our previous interactions hadn't. Whatever game she was playing, whatever her true motives might be, tonight would bring answers one way or another. I would discover what lay beneath the central courtyard, and perhaps begin to understand the enigma that was Alisara Velcroix. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, I made my decision. I would take her offer. I would follow her breadcrumbs to whatever truth lay waiting in the darkness beneath the Southern Sea Sun Palace. Whether that truth would save us or doom us remained to be seen. Chapter 455. Alisara Velcroix. 2. The girl stared back at me from the mirror, pink hair spilling over her shoulders like a rose-hued waterfall, eyes the color of cyan glass with hints of green. Familiar yet strange. I was Alisara Velcroix, chief advisor to the Lord of the Southern Sea Sun Palace, wielder of power that made immortal rankers tremble, cult leader of the Red Chalice. I was also someone else. My hand pressed against the cool surface of the mirror, as if trying to reach through to that other self that hovered at the edges of my consciousness. The memories came in fragments lately, disjointed scenes, emotions without context. A face with blue eyes that made my heart ache with a longing I couldn't understand. Arthur Nightingale. His name sent ripples through my mind, disturbing the careful order I'd maintained for decades. When I looked at him, something inside me recognized him. Not as prey, not as a pawn, but as something essential that I had lost. Ridiculous, I whispered to my reflection. You are Alisara Velcroix. You bow to no one. Yet the memories persisted, growing stronger each day since his arrival. I closed my eyes, allowing them to surface, curious what they might reveal today. A sterile government building. Fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. Arthur sitting across from me at a metal table, expression unreadable, calculating. His intellect was palpable, a quiet, resolute genius whose mind worked in ways that fascinated me even at 15. The agency had sent me to recruit him, but something unexpected happened. I saw beyond his mind to something deeper, something that made my young heart flutter when his eyes met mine. I opened my eyes, my breath coming faster. That wasn't my memory. Couldn't be. I had never worked for any agency, had never been tasked with recruiting anyone. And yet, I remembered the nervous anticipation as I prepared to meet him, the file I'd memorized detailing his extraordinary achievements, the way my superiors had emphasized his importance to our work. The memories were becoming more detailed, more specific. No longer just emotions or glimpses, but full scenes of a life I had never lived. A life as someone named Emma Castle. Emma. The name tasted strange on my tongue, yet familiar. It unsettled me, this invasion of self by another. I was Alisara, shaped by blood and cruelty, forged in flame and shadow. These memories of structured order and adolescent infatuation had no place in me. Yet they persisted, growing stronger with each day, each encounter with Arthur. I pushed away from the mirror, moving to my private chambers where ancient tomes lay open on my desk. Research into memory, soul transference, reincarnation. Topics I had dismissed as irrelevant until now. Nothing in them explained what was happening to me, this slow fracturing of identity. A different memory surfaced then, not Emma's past but my own dark beginnings. I was 7 years old, standing in a dimly lit chamber beneath my father's mansion. My small hand was engulfed in his larger one as he led me forward, his voice gentle but firm. You must learn, my little Rose, what true love means, he said, guiding me toward a large iron cage. Inside, a woman wept, beautiful despite her tears, her long hair tangled around her face. She looked up as we approached, her eyes finding mine with desperate intensity. Alisara, she whispered, my sweet girl. My father's grip tightened painfully on my hand. Your mother has been making poor choices, Alisara. She thought she could leave us. Leave me. The woman, my mother, shook her head frantically. Revan, please, not in front of her. She's too young for this. My father knelt beside me, turning me to face him. His eyes, so like my own, burned with something that frightened and fascinated me. She's never too young to learn about love. Real love. The kind that consumes everything. He snapped his fingers, and from the shadows came 2 figures, bound and gagged. An elderly man and woman, their eyes wide with terror. My mother screamed, lunging against the bars of her cage. No. Please no. Not my parents. My father's hand settled on my shoulder, warm and heavy. Watch carefully, Alisara. This is what happens when someone you love tries to escape. You remove every other attachment they have. You make yourself their entire world. That is how love endures. What followed was a lesson in blood and screams, in power and possession. My mother's parents died slowly, their lives extinguished as she watched, helpless to intervene. When it was over, something had broken in her. A light extinguished, replaced by empty obedience. Do you see now, my Rose? My father asked, wiping blood from his hands. She'll never try to leave again. She has nothing left but me. That is love in its purest form, complete possession. I gasped, the memory receding like a tide leaving jagged shells on the shore. My father's lessons had continued throughout my childhood, lessons in control, in breaking rather than nurturing, in equating love with absolute dominion. Such memories should have brought shame, or horror, or regret. Instead, they twined with Emma's memories of Arthur, creating something new and terrible. A desire not just for connection but for possession. A love warped by my father's teachings yet infused with Emma's genuine emotion. I wanted Arthur. Not just physically, not just emotionally, but completely. I wanted to own him, to break him, to reform him in the image of my desire. To make him mine in ways that transcended normal understanding of the word. "This isn't right," I whispered, Emma's voice momentarily stronger than my own. "This isn't what love should be." But Emma's influence was fragmented, weakened by the decades I had spent as Alisara. Her memories offered glimpses of healthier attachment. The flush of first love at 15, watching Arthur work through problems no one else could solve. The quiet pride when he acknowledged her insights despite her youth. But they couldn't override the fundamental nature my father had cultivated in me. I moved to the window, gazing at the red sun hanging in the night sky. Its crimson light bathed my skin, reminding me of the power I commanded, the cult that bowed to my will, the vampires who feared and respected me. Another memory surfaced. More recent, a conversation overheard between the vampire monarch and Cassius. "The gates of transcendence," the monarch had said, his voice weak but determined. "They exist beyond the boundary of high radiant rank. They are the threshold between merely powerful and truly divine." Cassius had scoffed. "A myth. No one has crossed them in 10,000 years. Because no one has possessed the raw ability," the monarch replied. "Not even I could cross them. But there is one among us who might. The gates of transcendence. My recent studies had uncovered references to them, a threshold that separated the highest radiant rankers from those who had ascended to pseudo-godhood. Not a barrier of philosophy or detachment, but one of sheer, overwhelming power and will. I understood now why I had been drawn to Arthur, why these memories of Emma had been surfacing. They were a test, a challenge to overcome. If I could harness this pure, young love Emma had felt for Arthur and twist it into the consuming possession my father had taught me, I would be fueling my ascension with the most powerful emotion possible. Arthur was my key to the gates of transcendence. By breaking him, by claiming him completely, I would achieve what even the vampire monarch could not. I would cross those gates through my sheer ability, enhanced by the purity of Emma's love corrupted by my will. The realization sent a wave of pleasure through me, a certainty that crystallized my fractured thoughts into singular purpose. I had arranged for Arthur to access the central chamber tonight to discover the vampire monarch. What happened after would determine both our fates. If Arthur tried to expose what he found, I would need to act quickly. The ritual to absorb my blood contract with the vampire monarch was already prepared. In his weakened state, he couldn't prevent me from taking what was rightfully mine, the power, the cult, the future. And Arthur? Arthur would be mine as well. Not as an advisor or an ally or even a lover in the conventional sense. He would be my possession, my conquest, my living proof that I had the ability to cross the gates that even the vampire monarch could not. Emma's memories whispered protests. The eager 15-year-old's heart, open and vulnerable, seeing in Arthur not just his genius but his humanity. But they were growing weaker against the tide of my determination. "I'm sorry, Emma," I whispered to the fractured presence inside me. "But this is who I am now. This is what love means to me." Chapter 456. Mind Break 1. I didn't know what I was doing anymore, which was a problem, because my mind, normally a finely tuned, coldly efficient, terrifyingly reliable instrument, had stopped being any of those things. It was fogged, blurred, like someone had swapped it with a second-hand processor running on spite and bad dreams. I needed to think. I needed to focus. I needed to stop the resurgence of the vampire monarch. That was my duty, my reason, the anchor to everything I'd built. And right now, it was the only thing that felt real. I ignored Luna's voice rattling around inside my skull. Whatever she was saying, it didn't matter. Not now. Her usual chaotic wisdom could wait. Or vanish. 2 guards from the Southern Sea Sun Palace stood before the door I needed to pass through. Both white rankers. Strong by normal standards, but right now I didn't have the patience to care about normal standards. One of them stepped forward, doing his best impression of authority. "This place is off." He didn't finish the sentence. Because sentences require heads. And his was now somewhere else entirely, not attached to the body it had been philosophically connected to seconds earlier. The second guard froze, eyes wide, sword halfway drawn before all neural signals between brain and arm were discontinued. The arm fell limp. He did too shortly after. I stepped forward and placed my palm against the door. It clicked open with a whisper, either in obedience or resignation. Again, I thought. It didn't even surprise me. I stepped into the corridor beyond. It didn't matter. None of it mattered anymore. I pivoted on instinct, swinging my blade in a tight arc to block the strike I felt coming a fraction before it landed. Metal rang against metal. Aura clashed. Sparks lit the dark. Seola skidded back, her expression more disappointed than surprised. "You were right," she said to someone behind her. "We should have kept a closer eye on him after he talked to her." Of course, her. But it wasn't just Seola. Rachel was there, silent but sharp-eyed. Serafina stood beside her, already drawing mana. Cecilia's red eyes shimmered. Rose looked hurt. "What are you doing, Arthur?" Lucifer asked. "This is a diplomatic disaster." Ah, so none of them understood. They never did. I was right. I was right. My aura flared. Wind-enhanced, sharp as a guillotine's edge. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask for understanding. I launched the attack. Their eyes widened as the blast shot toward them. But Seola intercepted it. Her blade coated in her own wind aura as she redirected the force into the stone walls. "This is not good," Lucifer muttered, already moving into position. I looked at them all. My so-called friends. My allies. I looked for them. For the 4 girls, Rachel, Serafina, Cecilia, Rose. "Help me," I thought. "Understand me." But Rachel shook her head, slowly. Serafina wouldn't meet my eyes. Cecilia's jaw was tight, her lips pressed into a grim line. And Rose just looked down. Felt like the floor had vanished. Something cracked. Not physically. Not yet. But deep, somewhere behind my ribs and beneath my spine. Something foundational. They betrayed you. The thought came unbidden. Unwanted. But it was there. They chose them over you. More than the betrayal, it was the loneliness that hit. The cold, echoing void that rushed in to fill the gap. No understanding. No trust. No faith. Only doubt. Only distance. And then came the rage. I let it out. My full power surged. Wind screaming around me. The floor fracturing. Energy pouring from every inch of my body like the world had finally decided to come undone. Cloaked in storm-forged aura, I stood alone. They'd chosen their side. Now they'd see mine. Lucifer licked his lips, a nervous habit he hadn't indulged in for years. This wasn't good. Arthur stood at the center of the corridor, wind aura crackling around him like a hurricane trying to reason with itself. His eyes were bright with something too sharp to be sanity. It was like watching a star go nova and knowing you were still on the same planet. Mana deviation. That was the technical term. Textbooks described it clinically like a malfunctioning engine. A disruption of emotional equilibrium leading to erratic mana behavior. But this wasn't erratic. This was focused, controlled. And that was the real problem. Mana was emotional. It wanted to reflect the heart. When people were sad, their spells flickered. When they were angry, things exploded. But when someone's mind started to break, really crack under pressure, and they were still in control, that was when people died. Arthur wasn't just strong. He wasn't just smart. He was both and now unhinged enough to make every calculation without the part of the brain that hesitated. Lucifer could feel it now on his skin, in his bones. That pressure. The sharp edge of something that didn't want to be restrained. Arthur wasn't flaring mana for show. His entire presence had become a statement. Do not get in my way. Lucifer clenched his jaw. A 1v1. Impossible. Not at his current strength. He'd lose, and probably spectacularly. Arthur wouldn't hold back. Not because he wanted to kill anyone, but because he wouldn't stop himself. He glanced at Rachel. Her lips were pressed into a tight line. Her sapphire eyes shimmered with something unspoken, something between grief and guilt. She looked like someone watching a house burn down that she used to call home. And it wasn't just her. Seraphina's fists trembled despite her icy calm. Rose's magic pulsed erratically at her fingertips. Cecilia looked like she wanted to scream but couldn't find the words. To ask them to fight Arthur would be cruel. So Lucifer took the burden. He stepped forward, each footfall echoing with purpose. His blade came free in a clean, metallic whisper. White mana, pure and luminous, wrapped around it like a vow. Order made manifest. On top of it, the chill of ice, his elemental second nature, spilled across the ground in a thin sheen. His verdant eyes glowed as God's eyes activated, flooding his vision with analysis, probability, and the 1,000 variables of Arthur's stance. He took one breath, and then he moved. Winter's Ascent, the first movement of the myth of the Northern Peak. A sword form forged in the howling tundras of the northern continent, where winter didn't just arrive, it ruled. This technique wasn't just about speed or power. It was about inevitability. Cold that crept into marrow and made the world stop breathing. The temperature dropped instantly. The moisture in the air crystallized. The corridor dimmed with the weight of frost and expectation. Lucifer struck, sword moving like a frozen waterfall. Beautiful, merciless, and impossible to stop. And Arthur didn't block. He let go of his own sword mid-swing, just enough to reach out with 2 fingers and touch Lucifer's blade. Lucifer's eyes widened. The white aura sliced into Arthur's fingertips. Blood welled up instantly, bright red against the icy air. But then, Arthur closed his hand, pushing his fist forward to meet the incoming blade. A pulse of force rippled out, and Lucifer's sword jerked backwards like it had been yanked by a magnetic backlash. Lucifer staggered, barely managing to stabilize himself with a surge of white mana. He realized too late what had happened. Arthur hadn't just countered the attack, he'd broken it. Not physically, strategically. He'd seen the weak point in Winter's Ascent, the exact spot where the movement transitioned between tempo and shattered its rhythm. Lucifer barely had time to recover when a 6-circle flame spell detonated across the hallway, roaring outward in a sweeping wave of fire. Heat rushed in, annihilating the frost that still clung to the air. The chill was gone, and Arthur was still standing, still burning, and Lucifer's shoulder tendon was overstrained. He was about to channel wind mana, let the green light crawl through his limbs and patch up the overused tissue. But a warm glow enveloped him before he could lift his hand. Rachel knelt beside him, her palm pressed against his shoulder. Her light-based healing magic shimmered like sunlit silk, softer than his own but infinitely more refined. Precise. Intentional. He blinked. I could've. I know, she said quietly. There was a flicker of something deeper in her magic. Not just a standard heal. Not a casual patch job. This was something else. The light intensified, turned golden. Holy. Rare. A divine miracle. Angel wings. Lucifer felt the strength surge back into his limbs. No, not just that. It went beyond. Golden wings unfurled from his back. Wings formed out of pure light manifested by a saintess. He turned to look at her fully, about to thank her. But then he saw her lip. She was biting it. Hard. Blood welled, trailing down her chin, unnoticed or uncared for. Her hands trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, but from the effort of keeping herself still. I'll stop him, she whispered. eyes locked on Arthur's distant figure. Because I love him. Chapter 457. Mind Break 2. Rachel had given Lucifer a divine miracle. Not a spell. Not a technique. A divine miracle. The kind that happened only when talent, desperation, and divine affinity all got fed into the same blender, and someone hit liquefy. Born from her gift and her absurdly rare talent for pure light, it was a surge of raw holy power. A blessing that wrapped around Lucifer like a second skin and supercharged his body to unnatural limits. It gave him wings, literally. Light-forged angel wings now shimmered behind him, burning mana to keep him airborne and fast enough to race thunder. It should have been enough. Maybe even more than enough. But then her eyes met his, Arthur's. Azure eyes. Brilliant, unblinking, and full of something that cut deeper than any blade. Pleading. Those weren't the eyes of a man on a rampage. They were the eyes of someone drowning under the surface, begging silently, subtly, for someone to understand, to stop him, to save him, maybe, from others, from himself. Rachel's breath hitched. Her heart twisted with guilt so strong she could have mistaken it for pain. Those eyes weren't fair. He wasn't fair. This was why she wanted to cage him, to keep him close, to hold him so tightly that the world couldn't touch him and he couldn't destroy himself. Because without that, without her, this happened. These moments happened, where the one person more important to her than herself stood in the middle of a battlefield, sword drawn, soul cracked, and no one else knew how to reach him. She blinked away tears and focused. There'd be time for guilt later, assuming there was a later. She lifted both hands and began weaving binding spells with pure light, not to destroy, but to restrain. Light gathered like strands of silk around her fingertips, each one humming with sealing intent. A net of holy spells not meant to harm, only hold. Meanwhile, Lucifer shot forward like a white comet. The angel wings behind him flared, boosting him across the field with enough speed to slice through sound. His sword was already in motion, white and black mana entwining in a double helix of perfectly controlled chaos. He was fast, precise, and terrifyingly complete. His strikes backed by the harmony of yin-yang body, enhanced with ice, layered over divine and infernal mana alike, and all of it sharpened further by the all-seeing clarity of God's eyes. But Arthur met him, and matched him, sword to sword, blow for blow. Because Arthur Nightingale was something else entirely. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement, no tell. His swordplay wasn't trained, it was breathed. His mythic body made him faster, stronger, lighter, denser. His sword resonance echoed in the air, each strike ringing like a hymn, each parry like a counterpoint in a perfectly orchestrated performance. Lucifer, talented as he was, found no gaps. Not a flicker, not a twitch. Even with God's eyes wide open, Arthur's form offered no openings. It was like trying to beat a machine designed solely to win a duel, and the machine was in a bad mood. Arthur's sword style shifted smoothly into Tempest Dance, a technique designed not to strike, but to overwhelm. Every swing fed the next, built up speed, force, rhythm. It was a dance meant for war, not sparring. It was elegant, yes, but elegant in the same way a tidal wave is elegant. Unstoppable, terrifying, and far too much to handle politely. And Lucifer, for all his strength, couldn't land a single blow, because Arthur could hurt him, and Lucifer couldn't bring himself to hurt Arthur. Every time Arthur left a vital point open, and he did, intentionally, tauntingly, Lucifer's blade slowed, twitched, hesitated. Arthur knew that. He used that. And so the gap grew. Silver-enhanced aura exploded outward from Arthur, ballooning to a crescendo. Lucifer braced, hand tightening around his sword, readying the grade 6 art that might, just might, counter the oncoming wave. But he didn't get to, because the air filled with plum blossoms. Blue plum blossoms. They danced through the battlefield like snow on a quiet battlefield. Beautiful, haunting, deadly. Seraphina's aura had arrived. Her ice-infused blossoms swirled around Arthur in delicate chaos, not aiming to kill but to disorient, to interrupt, to disturb the flow. And then came Rose's power. Blue roses bloomed midair, petals twisting through space like they couldn't decide what time it was. Paradox, a power that bent the rules and laughed while doing it. Her roses spiraled into Seraphina's blossoms, fusing in a dance that shouldn't have been possible. And then Cecilia's witchcraft slid in like a whisper. No light, no flash, just a change, the kind that made everything feel wrong. Made Arthur's steps falter, his timing break, his rhythm wobble. In 3 seconds, they shattered the Tempest dance. Not by overpowering it, but by unweaving it. Arthur's sword hesitated. His stance stumbled. Lucifer stepped in again, blade raised, eyes wide. One final question screaming in his head. Is it enough? Arthur's eyes darkened. Flat, bottomless. A shade of rage dipped in sorrow, and the world around him seemed to fold. Not literally, not yet, but it felt like reality was holding its breath. Crimson bones wrapped around his body, jagged and pulsing faintly. Bone armor of a lich. Lucifer's expression tightened. The god's eyes, which had been whirring and analyzing data like a military-grade targeting system, dimmed slightly. The deep dark interfered with precision. The very concept of clarity recoiled from it. It was heavy, and it was fast. This was what Arthur had become in his disappearance. This was the level he'd clawed his way to while the rest of them were still figuring out which gods were watching. And now that Lucifer could see it clearly, it wasn't just powerful. It was terrifying. Lucifer's sword pulsed with layers of power. Black mana, white mana, ice, light, shadow, and everything in between. A full mana spectrum boiled inside the blade. It had to. He needed everything. Nothing less would make a dent. Seraphina moved first. She always did. Her sword shimmered with frozen plum blossoms, cascading in a pattern designed to disrupt aura flow and stall momentum. But deep dark flames met her blossoms mid-air, devouring them like dry leaves. Arthur didn't parry so much as dismiss her strike, batting it aside before slamming his fist into her gut with bone-clad strength. She staggered, breath forced out in a choke. Arthur grabbed her by the hair. His hand hesitated just for a second, and that second was all she needed. Her blossoms surged forward, trying to dig into the gaps in the bone. They scratched. Barely. Then came the crimson chains, Cecilia's witchcraft, snaring his limbs, and the blue roses, curling in from behind, blades of paradox from Rose's gift. They bit deeper. They found weakness where Seraphina had softened the bone. Arthur bled, his skin nicked beneath cracked crimson plating. His eyes turned darker still. Then came the boom. One strike. He brought his blade down in a single sweeping arc, and everything shook. The ground cracked like it had been slapped by a vengeful god. It was the second movement of his grade 6 art Hollow Eclipse. Not just power, not just speed. It was destruction beautifully concentrated. All 3 girls were blasted back. Not broken, but pushed. Hard. And Lucifer was already there, sword flashing in from the side, silent as resolve. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, barely above the hum of their colliding mana. "I can't let you do something you'll regret." Because that's what this was. Mana deviation wasn't about rage. Not truly. It was about heartbreak. About breaking under the weight of emotion until your magic didn't know who to protect and who to kill. Arthur was past the line now, hurting those he cared about. And if this continued, there'd be no one left to save. So it had to end. Lucifer's blade drove in. But Arthur's eyes flashed. Pure light. First movement of his grade 6 art, God Flash. Lucifer's blade was thrown aside mid-thrust, the explosion of mana rocking the hallway. A wall disintegrated. Lucifer coughed, stumbling, blood on his lips. Arthur stood there, cracked bone armor still clinging to him like a nightmare, and for one moment it looked like he'd won. Except he hadn't. Because Lucifer's sword had still pierced him. Just enough. A clean line of red bloomed across Arthur's side. Arthur staggered, coughed, then raised his fist. Lucifer looked down. That fist was glowing. With it came the pressure of death. This was it. The kind of spell you didn't name because naming it would have made it real enough to fear. Lucifer couldn't move. His body wouldn't respond. Too slow. Too tired. He'd done all he could. Then the world shifted again. Not from magic, not from force. From touch. Rachel's arms wrapped around Arthur from behind. She didn't attack. She didn't restrain. She just held him. "Please stop, Arthur," she whispered. "Please." Lucifer's eyes widened. It wasn't a spell. It was love. Raw, desperate, wounded love. But sadly, love didn't solve everything. Not this time. Arthur turned. Slowly. Deliberately. Lucifer tried to rise, to intercept again. But he knew he was too slow. Until light speared through the room. Not golden. Not warm. Not merciful. A crucifix of pure light erupted into existence and pierced Arthur through the chest.
En astral impalement.
Formless, unannounced, executed with surgical precision. Arthur's body seized, eyes blanking. His crimson bone armor cracked, shattered, then disintegrated, piece by piece, until nothing was left but him. Bloodied, shaking, and suddenly small again. Rachel held him as he collapsed, sobbing into his shoulder, whispering apologies that no one could hear over the silence. And for the first time that day, Arthur didn't fight. Chapter 458. Mind Break 3. Lucifer touched his chest, still panting, as Arthur crumpled to the ground beneath the radiant mark of Rachel's final spell. Six-circle pure light spell. Crucifixion nullification. A name far too long for something so brutally efficient. It hadn't just restrained Arthur. It had erased the fight from his body. It wrapped him in divine light like a cosmic parent saying, "Enough now." And the body had listened. Or maybe it was the soul that had. Rachel let out a breath, ragged and wet with grief, tears pouring down her face, as if her heart had decided to break in every direction at once. She was still holding him, arms locked around his chest like she could keep him from fading if she just held tight enough. A moment later, Lucifer felt fingers grip his collar and yank. "Ciola." She hauled him upright with one hand, eyes calm in the way storms are calm before they remember they're supposed to be destructive. "Prince Lucifer," she said, her tone like polished steel. "Why did you stop me from joining the battle?" Lucifer met her golden gaze. Even now, bruised and spent, his eyes shone verdant and steady. "I didn't want you to get hurt for no reason," he said. Salah's nostrils flared. "Hurt?" she repeated, as if the word itself was an insult. "You think I'm that weak?" Lucifer shook his head. "No. But you had no reason to get involved." Crack. The slap hit like a gunshot in a closed hall. It sent him straight back to the ground, blinking up at the ceiling with the kind of expression normally reserved for people who just watched their plan backfire with artistic flair. A moment later, something thudded softly onto his chest. Potion. Healing, no doubt. The kind that said, "I'm angry, not cruel." He heard her boots moving away, echoing down the corridor. She didn't look back. But someone else was arriving. The steps were slow, deliberate, and far too cheerful for the occasion. Alisara Velcroix entered like someone arriving fashionably late to a scene they'd choreographed from the beginning. Bubblegum pink hair, eyes like frozen cyan fire, a smile that didn't quite reach either. The four girls noticed her instantly, and turned, like a pack of wolves suddenly catching the scent of something both wounded and unwelcome. The air crackled. Mana coiled. Rachel's fingers clenched tighter around Arthur. Alisara ignored all of it. She walked to Arthur's side as if none of them existed, knelt beside him and gently touched his cheek. Her touch was feather-light, almost reverent. She didn't acknowledge Rachel's arm wrapped around him, didn't even glance at it. "So close," she whispered, smiling faintly. "But not yet. It wasn't time." Rachel's sapphire eyes flared gold at the edges. A quiet warning that screamed, "Do not." "Get your hands off him," she said. Calm, measured, lethal. Alisara tilted her head. "Or what?" She didn't wait for an answer. Her eyes drifted across the others. Serafina, Rose, Cecilia, Wang. measuring. The fingers on her left hand twitched once. A single motion. Kill them, a thought that didn't need to be said. Her power hummed just beneath her skin, aching to be released. But then her eyes returned to Arthur. And they softened. Not now. Arthur Nightingale was still too weak. Even with all that fury and brilliance. Even with the Lich's gift and his precious swordplay and those pitiful emotions dragging him in every direction. He was still just an ant. A useful ant. A special one. But an ant nonetheless. She leaned in, brushing Rachel's grip aside like it was a curtain in her way. And she kissed him. It was brief, but real. The reaction was instant. Rachel shoved her off with more mana than muscle. Pure instinct and boiling wrath. Alisara staggered back a step, unfazed, licking her lips like she'd just sampled something intriguing. She stretched her arms above her head, back arching with feline indifference. "I've stabilized his body," she said casually, "and I'll hide this incident from Lord Daedric." "Why?" Rose asked, voice sharp with suspicion and disgust. Alisara rolled her shoulders. "Because I do as I wish." There was no pride in her voice, no drama, just fact, cold, quiet fact. She turned to leave, not bothering with goodbyes. Because in a world full of chains and rules and consequences, Alisara Velcroix walked alone. And that, perhaps, made her the most dangerous one in the room. Alisara glided into her room, her face unreadable, every step a calculated ripple on still water. She paused briefly, her lips curving into a fleeting smile before vanishing into her usual impassivity. "Alisara." A low, commanding voice called from the shadows. Cassius stepped forward, his crimson eyes gleaming as they locked onto hers. "Your Highness," she replied smoothly, tilting her head ever so slightly. "What brings you to my quarters?" Cassius hesitated, momentarily caught in her gaze. It was a look he had chased for years, one that always seemed to evade him, slipping through his grasp like smoke. "I came to find you," he finally said, his voice quieter than he intended. "What were you doing?" "Nothing that concerns your Highness," Alisara replied lightly, her tone as elusive as her smile. "What is it you seek from me?" His jaw tightened, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. Her words were polite, deferential even, yet they carried the weight of a chasm he could never bridge. "You know what I want, Alisara," he said, stepping closer, his voice thick with frustration. "Must you always deny me?" Her eyes flickered, the barest hint of amusement in their cyan-green depths. "The only one capable of commanding me is His Majesty," she said, her tone light yet final. "I am the future vampire monarch," Cassius snapped, his voice rising with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Can you not love me?" Alisara's lips twitched, a soft giggle escaping as she regarded him. "Your Highness," she said, her voice low and lilting, "you do not want my love." Her steps were deliberate, closing the distance between them with the grace of a predator circling its prey. Cassius's breath hitched as she drew closer, her presence an intoxicating force that threatened to drown him. "My love," she whispered, her breath a feather against his ear, "is far too dangerous for you." Cassius trembled, his body rigid with a mix of desire and fear. He wanted to move, to seize her and claim the connection he craved, but he couldn't. Her words were chains, her presence a snare. The air seemed heavier, charged with an unspoken challenge. He breathed deeply, his chest heaving as she leaned even closer, her proximity a deliberate provocation. Cassius felt powerless, bound not by force but by the sheer weight of her being. Alisara stepped back, her gaze cool and untouched. "If your Highness truly desires something dangerous," she said, her voice dripping with mockery, "then perhaps you should reconsider what you're asking for." Cassius said nothing, his crimson eyes narrowing as she turned away, dismissing him as easily as one might swat a fly. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Alisara alone once more. Her fleeting smile returned, curling at the edges of her lips as she whispered to herself, "How amusing." Chapter 459. Mind Break 4. "What?" Cecilia said, her voice sharp with surprise, like she'd bitten into something that wasn't supposed to bite back. "What did you just say?" The conference room fell silent, its stark lighting casting harsh shadows across the faces of everyone present. Professor Nero stood at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral, hands clasped behind his back. The practiced pose of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news to volatile recipients. "We've been granted a 3-day extension by Lord Daedric," he repeated, slowly and clearly, as if announcing a weather delay and not an unfolding diplomatic mystery. "We'll resume investigations for 3 more days, which will culminate in a formal festival hosted by the palace." Silence. The kind that isn't born from awe but from suspicion. Heavy and charged, like the air before lightning strikes. Rachel's gaze narrowed. 3 days, she muttered, voice almost too quiet to hear. Her thoughts had already darted far ahead, landing squarely on the only person with enough influence and gall to arrange something like this. Alisara Velcroix, of course. Rachel clenched her fist beneath the polished obsidian table, feeling her nails bite into her palm. There was no doubt in her mind. Alisara had done this too. The other girls didn't need to say anything. Rachel caught their glances across the table, Seraphina's subtle nod, her silver eyes calculating. Rose's brief tightening of her jaw, fingers curling around her datapad until her knuckles whitened. Cecilia's narrowed crimson glare burning with the intensity of a dying star. All thinking the same thing. The Southern Sea Sun Palace's advisor, Alisara Velcroix, the woman wrapped in riddles, velvet words, and veiled threats, had, in one graceful move, completely disrupted everything again. The same woman who had somehow driven Arthur to the brink, twisted him into a mana-deviated storm they'd barely managed to restrain. And now this, an extension, a festival, a delay. And for what? It wasn't generosity. It was maneuvering. "Is there anything else we should know about this festival?" Seraphina asked, her voice cool and measured, betraying nothing of the suspicion Rachel knew she harbored. Professor Nero shook his head. "Details are still forthcoming. I'm told the official announcement will come tomorrow morning." Lord Daedric seemed pleased with the arrangement. "Pleased?" Rose echoed, the word hanging in the air like a challenge. "How unexpected." Professor Nero's eyes flicked briefly to her, then away. "That's all I have for now. I suggest you all use these additional days wisely." With that, the briefing ended. The professor gathered his notes with mechanical precision and departed, leaving behind a room thick with unspoken questions. No one suggested a meeting. They didn't need to. There were no spoken invitations, no messages, just an unspoken agreement formed from shared looks and mutual dread. Rachel's room, as always, it had become the unofficial war room for matters involving Arthur. And lately, those were the only matters worth discussing. Rachel kicked her door shut behind them, the magnetic locks engaging with a soft hiss. She sat down with a sigh, her boots kicked off in the middle of the floor, eyes staring at nothing. The setting sun spilled orange light through the western windows, painting stripes across the utilitarian furnishings. From somewhere outside came the distant sound of training drills. Life continuing as normal, despite everything. "It's always my room," she said wearily, running a hand through her auburn hair. "Deal with it, Ray Ray." Cecilia shot back, flopping onto the couch like she owned it, her long legs dangling over the armrest. "Don't fight," Seraphina said, voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel through silk. She stood by the window, silhouetted against the sunset, her silver hair capturing the dying light. "This is important." That shut them up. Because yes, of course it was. Of course it was important. But that didn't make it easier to accept. Rose settled into a chair near Rachel's desk, her movements precise and controlled. Of the four, she appeared the most composed, but Rachel knew better. The slight tightness around her eyes, the way she kept her spine too straight, Rose was wound tight as a coiled spring. "Has anyone been allowed to see him?" Rose asked, breaking the heavy silence. Rachel shook her head. "Medical wings locked down. Director Voss won't even let me in. Says Arthur's condition is delicate." The word tasted bitter on her tongue. None of them had seen Arthur lose control like that. Not ever. He was the anchor in chaos, the calm in battle, the one who always had a plan, usually a terrifying one that worked better than it had any right to. But not this time. This time he'd cracked. And not because of war. Not because of enemies. Because of her. Because of Alisara Velcroix. And that made it worse. Because the enemy wasn't something they could punch or blast or stab. It was subtle. Wrapped in silk and lips that smiled while slipping daggers between your ribs. And none of them knew how to fight that. Not yet. "Who the hell is she?" Cecilia said, sitting up abruptly, pacing like she was deciding which wall to punch first. Her crimson eyes flashed in the fading light, power rippling beneath her skin like barely contained lightning. How can she mess with Arthur's head that much? She didn't shout. Not really. But the force behind her voice was enough to rattle the windows slightly, possibly out of sympathy. No one answered right away. Because what could they say? There was no easy explanation for Alisara Velcroix. She was beautiful, yes. Charismatic, certainly. But this wasn't infatuation. This wasn't a teenage crush spun out of control. Arthur wasn't weak-minded, Arthur didn't break. And yet he had. Shattered like porcelain under pressure. "Something's not right about all this," Rachel said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "The timing is too perfect." 3 pairs of eyes focused on her intently. "What do you mean?" Serafina asked. Rachel stood, pacing a tight circle. "Think about it. 2 days ago, Alisara corners Arthur in the West Corridor. Yesterday, he has his episode. Today, we get this mysterious extension and festival announcement." Cecilia froze mid-pace. "You think she planned all of it?" Her voice had lost its edge, replaced by something dangerously close to concern. Rachel nodded. "It's too coordinated to be coincidence." "But what could she possibly gain?" Rose whispered. "What's her endgame with Arthur?" Serafina sat silently with her arms crossed, eyes narrowed in thought. Her fingers tapped a complex rhythm against her arm, a nervous habit she'd never fully conquered. "She has an agenda," Serafina concluded. "The extension, the festival. She's creating opportunities. But for what?" Rose's lips were pressed into a thin line, fingers drumming restlessly against the side of her leg. "Access," she suggested. "To Arthur, to us, to something in the palace itself." Rachel said nothing, her gaze fixed somewhere between memory and anger. The sunset had faded, leaving the room in twilight gloom. Then came a knock. They all looked up, instantly alert. For pairs of eyes locked on the door like it had personally insulted them. Cecilia's hands ignited with a subtle crimson glow. Serafina shifted her weight, ready to move. Rose had somehow produced a slender blade from nowhere. Rachel stood, signaling the others to stay back. She moved to the door with the deliberate caution of someone approaching an unexploded mine. "Identify," she demanded, voice flat. "It's Lucifer," came the reply, muffled through the door. Rose got up, joining Rachel at the door. She moved with the kind of cautious grace that suggested she fully expected something on the other side to explode. With a soft hiss of magnetic locks disengaging, the door slid open. Her brown eyes widened slightly. Lucifer. He stood in the hallway, tall and composed in his academy uniform, dark hair falling across one eye. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in the line of his shoulders that Rachel recognized immediately. "I figured you'd all be here," he said, standing just outside, posture calm and unreadable as always. "Mind if I come in?" Rose glanced back. A brief, silent conversation passed between the 4 women. Rachel nodded once, tight, reluctant, but definite. Rose stepped aside. "Fine. Come in." Lucifer walked in with the careful energy of someone entering a room filled with armed negotiators. Which technically he was. "You're probably talking ab. Hey, stalker." Cecilia cut in, glaring at him with all the fire of a volcanic political scandal. "How the hell did you know we were meeting here?" Lucifer blinked, momentarily disarmed by the sheer volume of chaos packed into one crimson-eyed princess. He'd forgotten how intense Cecilia was when not distracted by Arthur. She'd mellowed a bit after falling for him. Or maybe just redirected the madness in his direction. Either way, it was easy to forget that under the charm and teasing and slightly terrifying fondness, Cecilia Slatemark was also utterly, unapologetically dangerous. "In my defense," Lucifer said, hands raised as though fending off divine judgment, "it was fairly obvious you were all rattled by the announcement and Arthur's incident." He paused, then added, "Also, I asked Dia to confirm it." "You're that close with her?" Serafina asked, arching an eyebrow. Lucifer nodded without hesitation. "She respects bluntness." "I'm very blunt." Rachel crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing slightly, but she said nothing. In the quiet that followed, she reached over and activated the room's lights. Warm illumination chased away the shadows, revealing the concern etched on Lucifer's usually impassive face. "What do you want?" Rachel finally asked, voice flat. Lucifer exhaled and looked around at the four of them. "Look, I'm not here to make trouble. I came because I think you need to hear something. All of you." His voice wasn't cold, but it was steady. Too steady. And that was the first sign that what he was about to say wasn't going to be good. Chapter 460. Mind Break 5. Rachel blinked as Lucifer spoke. Then, without warning, she launched forward like a plasma bolt. Lucifer didn't even get a chance to flinch before she tackled him, knocking him clean off his feet and onto the carpeted floor of her own room. Again. Her knees pinned his shoulders, and her hands gripped his collar tight enough to wrinkle fabric engineered not to wrinkle. "What did you just say?" she hissed, eyes blazing. The kind of fury that didn't burn, it froze. Cold, furious logic swirled in her expression, and the emotion underneath it was betrayal. Lucifer kept his hands raised in the universal gesture of, "Please don't murder me before I finish explaining." "Ratch," he said, slowly and carefully, as if trying to disarm a bomb with his words. "Just." "Rachel, relax," Rose said quickly, stepping closer, though not close enough to get caught in the splash radius. "Relax," Rachel snapped, shoulders trembling. "How the hell do I relax? We fought Arthur over this. We restrained him. We stabbed him. And now you're telling me we're going where he was going." There was silence. One of those silences so heavy it had texture. Serafina, who hadn't moved from her place against the wall, spoke next. Her voice was like moonlight over cold steel, soft, but not gentle. "Rachel, stand down." Rachel didn't move, but she was listening. "I want to draw my sword too," Serafina said, her golden eyes flickering faintly. "But right now we need clarity, not revenge. If what Lucifer's saying is true, then we need to understand the whole picture. Losing control won't help Arthur." Slowly, reluctantly, Rachel eased off Lucifer, though her glare remained locked onto him like a targeting laser. Lucifer sat up, exhaling like someone who'd just been let off death row. He ran a hand through his hair and adjusted his collar with the vague indignity of someone who had been both right and tackled. He looked at them all, Rachel, still seething, Rose, worried, Serafina, taut with tension, and Cecilia, whose silence was more dangerous than any insult. "We need to infiltrate the place Arthur was trying to reach," Lucifer said finally. There it was, the sentence that made the room recoil. The four women stiffened as one, like they'd all been slapped by the same invisible hand. "No," Rachel said immediately. "No, we fought him to stop him from doing that. He broke. He killed people because he was trying to force his way into that place. That place," Rose added, voice tight, "was the reason he lost control. And now you're saying we're going to finish what he started? Cecilia asked, her tone flat, dangerously flat. Lucifer's gaze didn't waver. He wasn't right. There was weight in his words. Not anger. Not defensiveness. Just certainty. He wasn't right, he repeated, because he killed innocent guards without care. He saw them as obstacles, not people. He was ready to destroy anyone in his way, even if they had nothing to do with what he suspected. Rachel looked down, jaw clenched. We don't justify that, Lucifer continued. But that doesn't mean he was entirely wrong either. Something is there. Something they're hiding. But if we go in, we do it properly. Together. And with restraint. There was a long pause. And then Serafina spoke, voice colder than before. So now we walk the same path. But with regret at our backs. No one argued. Because they knew. Arthur might have broken too far to save that day. But now they had to follow the pieces he left behind. And pray they could still fix something. Anything. Before it all shattered again. Rose moved to the center of the room, activating her datapad. A holographic layout of the Southern Sea Sun Palace flickered to life, casting the room in a pale blue glow. Let's be methodical about this, she said, fingers tracing through the light to magnify a section. If we're going to infiltrate the lower archives, we need a plan that doesn't end with us becoming mana-deviated wrecks. Or dead, Cecilia added, finally finding her voice again. She approached the hologram, studying it with narrowed eyes. Lucifer nodded. The archives are here. He pointed to a sealed section beneath the eastern wing. 3 layers of security, diplomatic clearance required, and a rotating staff of elite guards. Sounds delightful, Rachel muttered, arms crossed tight across her chest. And how exactly do you propose we get in? We can't just flash our academy badges and hope they roll out the red carpet. The festival, Serafina said suddenly, understanding dawning in her eyes. That's why the timing matters. The palace will be full of guests. Security stretched thin across multiple zones. Exactly, Lucifer confirmed. Plus, Lord Daedric will be occupied with his duties as host. It's our best chance to access the restricted areas without triggering every alarm in the place. After the meeting ended and the last threads of argument and tension had finally settled into uneasy agreement, Lucifer left Rachel's room. Not toward his quarters, but toward another destination entirely. He stood outside the door of Siola Moyong's room, staring at it like it might bite. He took a breath, then knocked. The door slid open with a mechanical hiss that felt far too judgmental. Siola stood inside, expression unreadable, as always. She didn't look surprised to see him. Then again, she rarely looked anything. She wore composure like body armor. Lucifer nodded, shifting awkwardly, a familiar weight pressing down on his chest like guilt dressed in diplomatic robes. About earlier, he began. With Arthur. Stop. Her voice was sharp, not loud, just precise, like a knife sliding between thoughts. If you're here to justify pushing me behind you while everyone else fought, don't bother. I've heard enough versions of it was for your own good in my life. That threw him, not because she was wrong, but because Siola rarely let irritation slip through her voice. She was one of the few people he knew who could frown without moving a single muscle. I'm not here to justify it, Lucifer said, straightening slightly. I'm here to say I was wrong. That got a reaction. A flicker in her pale eyes, skepticism, maybe, or shock in disguise. I said it wasn't your business, that you didn't need to fight for us. He hesitated, then forced the words out. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared you'd get hurt. And that fear clouded my judgment. You were scared, Siola repeated, testing the word like it might be poisonous. Yes, the admission landed with the dull finality of something that had been true for far too long. When Arthur started to fall apart, all I could think about was getting you out of harm's way, he said. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't protocol. It was instinct. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that could tip into anything. Anger, mockery, forgiveness. She studied him with eyes that felt too ancient for her age. Lucifer looked away, then back again. We need your help, he said, pushing past the awkwardness. We're going back to finish what Arthur started. She narrowed her eyes, not in anger, but focus. Back there, to the sealed wing. During the festival, he nodded. Security will be light, scattered. Too many nobles, too many guests. It's the best chance we'll have. And you want me with you. We need you, he said. Not as backup, as part of the core team. She turned away, back to her window. Moonlight painted her profile in soft silver, cutting a perfect divide between shadow and light. The last time something like this happened, she said slowly, you physically pushed me behind you, ordered me to stay out of the way. You told me, and I quote, "This isn't your fight, Ciola." Lucifer winced. I remember. I do too, she said flatly. I was wrong to do that. Yes, she agreed, calm as ever. You were. He stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. I'm here now not because I need to tick a box on a mission plan. I'm here because I owe you more than that. You've always deserved to be part of this. I just let my personal feelings interfere. Your personal feelings? Her voice was low, but not cold. I didn't want to see you get hurt, he admitted. Each word felt like walking barefoot across sharp glass. That was selfish. I know that now. So you decided for me, she said. Yes, he said again. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she stared out the window as if the moonlight held answers she couldn't get from him. Eventually, she nodded once. Yes, you were wrong. Lucifer stayed quiet. But, she added, stepping away from the window, I understand why you did it. She stopped in front of him, arms folded, face calm again. Tell me about this festival, she said, and when, exactly, you plan to break into one of the most heavily protected buildings on the island. Lucifer exhaled, tension slipping off his shoulders like fog. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was enough.